Well, hello, everyone. How are you doing tonight? Good to see you. Glad you're joining me here this evening. It is summertime in New York City. Those hot days where you go out and you walk in the sun and you get that tired feeling because it's hot and the sun is bright. But the sun has set in New York City and my energy seems to be returning. And now I'm going to do what I love to do, which is talk to you. It's been a while since we've had one of our late night conversations or afternoon conversations. So I'm glad that you're all here. Welcome back. I've got plenty of orange juice. Plenty of orange juice. It's nighttime. If it were afternoon, we'd be having diet beverage, but I do want to sleep at some point tonight. So diet beverage is not on the agenda. But we're here. We're back. It is summertime. The world seems to be slowing down, but perhaps not really. So much keeps happening, so much to say, so much to do. So, welcome, welcome, welcome. As always, I would appreciate it if you would share this, make it a Facebook post, make it a status, make it a Twitter tweet, tweet it out, share it, make this a bigger conversation. The more people that are here, the more fun we have. You put this on social media, you bring your friends, we have more fun. As always, I will answer any super chat. If you send me a super chat, I will give you an answer. It may not be the answer that you want, but it will be an answer if you give me a super chat. Furthermore, remember that with super chats, the folks at Google YouTube are getting about 30%. But if you want to support my work, and if you just want to make a contribution, you're not concerned about having me read off or answer your question, you can always now become a supporter of me on Patreon. I have set up a Patreon account. A few people have joined. So if you want to just support the work that we're doing, no need to go through the YouTube Google middleman and ask me a question. Just sign up below for the Patreon. Patreon support is appreciated. We're building the Center for Political Innovation. So the more work that we can do, the better. The more support we can get, the better. But in the meantime, in light of the China deal, will the socialist camp need to return to be more blatantly anti-imperialist? Yes, I'm going to be talking about that. Iran-China deal. And the way it works, the format we've been doing lately is I give kind of my opening news roundup and inspirational comments. And once that's done, once we've finished with that, I do the roll call. Iran-China deal. We do the roll call. And after that, after the roll call, at that point, I start answering your super chats. Now, did I miss one? Because did one go by that I missed? I saw the one about the Iran-China deal, socialist camp. But what about the? Was there another super chat that people wanted me to address? Was there another one? I thought the numbers there don't exactly add up, but whatever. I mean, okay, I guess I didn't miss anything. So if that's the case, folks, I will do my news roundup. And I will talk about world events and things that are happening in the world, make a few comments, and then from there, we will do our roll call, where I call you out names and locations as I see you. Then I will answer any super chat questions, and that'll be our evening. So, with no further ado, let's jump into it. Now, probably the biggest news story of the past 24 hours has been this video, and it's confirmed that on the streets of Portland, Oregon, the Trump administration seems to be having federal agents detain people. Oh, socialism and animal rights. Interesting. And I saw this story break like a few days earlier, and at first it seemed like nobody was jumping on top of it. It was one of these things where it was just a couple outlets that covered it. But then today, Washington Post, New York Times, they all jumped on top of it. And essentially, it's the Department of Homeland Security is on the ground in Portland, Oregon, And they've been going after activists and dissidents. They've been abducting them in unmarked vans for a few hours to try and intimidate them, covering their faces, things like that. They've been dispersing tear gas that the federal courts have said local police are not allowed to disperse. And it's setting off a lot of people's alarm bells, right? The idea of the government disappearing people, the idea of the federal government, basically going out and doing what local police generally do and trying to quell street unrest and protests is extremely disturbing to people for obvious reasons. We should all be very disturbed by it. Now, the closest thing to this that we've seen in recent years. Now, yes, most people that are being detained are only being held for a few hours and then released. But what's disturbing, I guess, the most disturbing thing, to most people about this, is that these police officers, they're not police officers, these federal agents, they're not wearing any badges. You don't know who they are. Their vans are unmarked. They grab people and hold them to kind of frighten them. And they're doing this in addition to the other activities they're doing in the streets of Portland. Now, the closest thing to this we've seen in recent years would be in 2012 during the Chicago NATO summit. When there was a NATO summit in Chicago in 2012, I believe it was in May or June, early summer, there was a NATO summit in Chicago. And the Obama administration detained people in Hoban Square in Chicago. And federal agents and local Chicago police detained some anarchist activists in Hoban Square and tortured them. And you can actually read, they had a black site, they called it, in Hoban Square. And people that were protesting against the NATO summit were detained there. And some of them actually beat their charges in court. They were charged with terrorism and things like that, and they actually beat the charges in court. But that didn't change the fact that they were detained in this facility, handcuffed to the floor for hours and things like that. It was quite a disturbing thing. And that this Hoban Square black site was being used against the African American community in Chicago as well, as there continues to be, a situation where there's, a lot of violence on the streets of Chicago. The quote unquote anti-gang operations of the Chicago Police Department for a long time seemed to involve taking people to this black site and torturing them. If you tell people about Hoban Square, the response that most people would give you is to roll their eyes. Yeah, right. Oh, the government has this place. It's taking U.S. citizens and torturing them. Yeah, right, Caleb. That sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory. Why don't you move to some other country? Where did you hear that? Where did you hear that? Did you hear that on crazy leftist websites or something? Well, it's a fact. I mean, you Google Hoban Square. It's just a fact, right? The Intercept has covered it. Democracy Now! Has covered it. I mean, it's acknowledged, but mainstream media decided not to run with it. They decided just not to run with it. They weren't going to touch it. But it did happen. At this point now we know about the Trump administration on the streets of Portland. Again, they're not holding people for days and days like they were at Hoban Square. They're kind of grabbing people for a few hours to kind of shake them up and threaten them. They're dispersing tear gas and, they also hit people with munitions, with impact munitions, they call it, like rubber bullets. They've hit people in the head and severely injured them and such. And that on some level, Donald Trump is trying to show off to his base that, the local Democrat mayors aren't fighting the left. I'm going to fight the leftists. But what's interesting is it seems to be that because of the situation, being that the Trump administration is doing it, that there's a Democratic administration in the city of Portland that doesn't approve, it seems like there is now opposition to this, right? Usually the media tries to kind of look the other way in situations like this, but because it's Trump that's doing it, it looks like, today we saw the Washington Post and the New York Times and a lot of outlets run with this. So that kind of shows that divisions among the ruling class can be beneficial because they are making this into a scandal, right? This is certainly ringing people's fascism alarm bell, the fact that, people are being grabbed up off the street by federal agents and stuff. And, and that's kind of causing people to want to stop this. Now, Obama, it seems, got away with a lot more of this kind of stuff, but because Trump has so many enemies in the ruling class, we're in a situation where this kind of thing is being condemned. So that's an important situation. That's probably the biggest news story that I saw today. But there's other news stories as well. Someone already mentioned in the super chats about the Iran-China deal. The Islamic Republic of Iran and the People's Republic of China are on the brink at this point of signing a 25-year military and economic partnership. And I'm going to talk about that later in the conversation. But I figured we might do what we often do on our little broadcasts that we have. And the latest issue of The Economist has come out, and they do their weekly news roundup. And so I sometimes like to read to you with commentary some of the things that the Economist decided to let us know about, and give you the background information that The Economist and other neoliberal free market sources are not going to give us. Thoughts about the talk about a Great Reset. Okay. So, Brazil's president, Bolsonaro, who has downplayed the threat of COVID-19, flouted social distancing guidelines, said that his athletic history would protect him, tested positive for coronavirus. So yes, the rumors that were circulating have been confirmed. Bolsonaro does indeed have COVID-19. And this is just the icing on the cake of the epic disaster of the Bolsonaro administration. It has been an epic disaster from the beginning. Economically, politically, it's been an absolute disaster. His policies have just been a nightmare, right? Whether it's the Amazon, on fire, whether it's the economic situation in the country, Bolsonaro has been a nightmare. And again, look at the situation in Brazil, right? Until 2016, the Social Democrats were in power. First you had Lula da Silva, then you had Dilma Rousseff. Then in 2016, they gave up on social democracy and the welfare state, and there was an impeachment that many people almost saw as a coup, where the U.S. government was working closely with the opposition. She was ousted. Dilma Rousseff was ousted. Michel Temer took office. It was revealed that Michel Temer had been working with the CIA to bring down Dilma Rousseff, and immediately started implementing free market reforms, and the economy fell apart. So then, after Michel Temer, he had the lowest approval rating of any recent president of Brazil's history, they had an election. And all the polls showed that if Lula da Silva, the Social Democrat from the Workers' Party, were actually able to participate in that election, he would have won. However, the court stepped in. They charged him with corruption and prevented Lula da Silva from running. So Bolsonaro, the right-wing demagogue, very pro-Israel, very free market, libertarian, very known to make racially insensitive comments, known to be homophobic, he was elected. And again, they promised that free market reforms were going to bring Brazil a new day. Everything was going to get better. Hadn't happened. Has not happened yet. And in fact, things have gotten significantly worse. And his handling of the COVID-19 situation has been a total disaster. An epic disaster, a disaster of preposterous, epic proportions. And as a result, things in Brazil have gotten worse. Now, since then, it's been revealed that the trial of Lula da Silva, the Social Democratic president, who wanted to be who would have won the election according to every poll, that the trial against him was rigged, that the prosecutor and the judge were texting each other throughout the trial, giving each other advice and pointers, right? Did you follow Barry Weiss? Yeah, I'll talk about that. All right. So the judge and the prosecutor were in cahoots, and it was a frame-up. It was just completely a frame-up. So there you go. Yeah, and now he has COVID-19, even though he said because he was athletic he could never get COVID-19 and didn't social distance. Now, to top it all off, Bolsonaro has COVID-19. It seems like free market, libertarian, neoliberal, capitalist policies are not very good at dealing with a situation like COVID-19. What country has had it the worst of any country in the industrialized Western capitalist world? The United States. South America, what country has had it the worst? Brazil. What countries have dealt with it very, very effectively? Venezuela, Cuba. What countries have dealt with it very, very effectively in Asia? China. China got it before anybody else. No warning whatsoever. They got it, and they dealt with it. And their economy is already moving ahead. Vietnam handled it very, very well, moving ahead. The Kerala section of India handled it very, very well. That's the section of India run by communists, by the Communist Party of India, Marxist. Yeah, the free market is not very good at handling collective problems, and COVID-19 is a collective problem. It is a collective problem. It is not a problem that affects individuals. It is a problem that affects all of society. And if your attitude is you're on your own, society has no obligation to the individual has no obligation to society, if that's your attitude, you can't really deal with this, right? The health of one is the health of all. That is what we have learned from this pandemic. That if one person doesn't have access to health care, it ain't just their problem. It is the problem of all of society. So, in the United States, where we still can't get it together to provide health care to all of our population, in which we, made things almost a little bit worse with Obamacare, in which health care has become a huge ripoff, the HMO schemes, we've had a big problem. In the United States, where our attitude toward the market and the private sector is you're on your own, well, things haven't been going so well. But let's remember, Donald Trump has a new ad campaign. Find something new. What? You're down on your luck? You lost your job because of the pandemic? Find something new. So that's the advice of the White House. Go find something new. Catchy, huh? But yeah, that's the situation we're in. So, the fact that Bolsonaro himself now has COVID-19 just kind of is the icing on the cake of all of this. Fabian Gutierrez, who was secretary to Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, Argentina's president from 2007 to 2015, and now its vice president, was murdered. Mr. Gutierrez had agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in the notebook scandal centered on bags of cash delivered to the officials during Ms. Fernandez's presidency and to her home. She denies wrongdoing. Mr. Gutierrez's murder is not thought to be politically motivated. Right. They have been running this idea that socialist governments are corrupt, right? We know about the Panama Papers and the entities that have been just trying to dump these allegations of corruption very strategically against geopolitical rivals of the United States. They went after Cristina Kirchner. They went after Isabel dos Santos in Angola. And this allegation against anti-imperialist leaders, this idea that they're all corrupt, which is a very hard thing to define, and corruption is very, very widespread in the developing world on all sides of the political spectrum. That's been a running theme. And of course, the innuendo, even if you read this article, even though it says she denies wrongdoing, Mr. Gutierrez's murder is not thought to be politically motivated. They're still trying to insert into people's minds that Cristina Kirchner killed this guy off to cover up. And Cristina Kirchner, she's done some dramatic things. For example, there was a bombing in Argentina that the United States media and the Western media blamed on the Islamic Republic of Iran. And she got up at the United Nations and boldly said, very boldly, that Iran was not responsible, and that the evidence gathered by Argentina's intelligence showed that Iran was not responsible for the attack. That was quite bold. A harsh critic of Israel. Very socialistic, very strong in her defense of Venezuela. Cristina Kirchner has always gotten a thumbs up from me. I've always liked her. And so the fact that they really tried to frame her up with these corruption charges, just like they did, remember, with Lula da Silva, and that turned out to be bunk. It was just a way to keep him out of the election. Well, folks, looks like we're back to square one. So, yes, Cristina Kirchner, now the vice president of Argentina. Interesting situation. Next item. A British judge ruled that Venezuela's de facto president, Nicolas Maduro, cannot access $1.8 billion of gold held by the Bank of England because Britain recognizes the leader of the opposition, Juan Guaido, as the president. Now, the name for that is theft. And that this is a very common practice, mind you. This is something that Western capitalism and imperialism has done a long time. They really want all the countries of the world to have their money stored in American banks. And then, of course, that gives them the ability to freeze the assets, and in some cases hand them over to other people. And this is theft. They blame the Venezuelan government. They say, look, there's food shortages there. Well, they'd probably be more able to provide food to the population if all their money wasn't being frozen. And this is not the only example of this. A lot of Venezuela's assets have been frozen. This is money that belongs to the country, and it has been frozen, and stolen, as the U.S. government and the British government intend to sabotage and wreck these socialist countries and keep them poor and impose problems. So there you go. It's very similar to what was done to the Islamic Republic of Iran. You'll recall that when the Iran nuclear deal went down, it was announced by the right-wing media that Obama gave Iran so many billions of dollars. Eurasian is it in response to Neil thoughts on Russia-China's joint declaration. Okay, Eurasian infrastructure projects. So, it was announced by the right wing that the U.S. government gave billions of dollars to Iran. Well, the reality was that this was Iran's money, right? Iran, at the time of the Iranian Revolution, had a whole bunch of money, the Shah's government, the Persian, the Pahlavi dynasty, had a whole bunch of money in American banks. And at the time of the revolution, the U.S. government froze those funds. So that was already Iran's money, and it just sat frozen in bank accounts in the United States. They gave the new Iranian government no access to it. When the nuclear deal was signed, Iran got its money back. So Obama didn't give Iran money. Iran got access to its own money. That's what happened. But of course, they distort that. And that this is a game they like to play a lot, where they freeze people's assets. They forcibly take things. This is a game that they love to play. The Trump administration gave formal notice to the World Health Organization that America will withdraw from the body on July 6th, 2021. Joe Biden says he will scrap that decision and rejoin the World Health Organization if he is elected president in November. There are differences within the ruling class. Let's be real about it. And you'll remember that John Bolton, who used to be part of the Trump administration, he's now an enemy of the Trump administration, but he was briefly part of it, that he was known for saying things like there is no UN. When he was UN ambassador, he disregarded the United Nations. When it comes to the UN, when it comes to these international bodies, there are differences within the ruling class. And, for a long time, there has been an ultra-right in this country that is very, very opposed to the United Nations. The John Birch Society, get us out of the UN and the UN out of us. There's been this kind of right-wing populist notion that somehow the UN is, violating the sovereignty of the United States. And there are sections of the right wing that very much feel like the United States shouldn't have to cooperate with the United Nations. The Trump administration also opposes the International Criminal Court. George Soros was very key in setting up the International Court. So was Britain and a lot of European Union countries. And it's the International Criminal Court is awful. I mean, it's a place where they drag mainly African leaders. And they use it to carry out regime change and push that human rights propaganda to tear down anti-imperialist governments. International Criminal Court is not good, but there's a difference about whether or not the United States should be a signatory and abide by it. The Bush administration and the Trump administration doesn't think the United States should be part of the International Criminal Court. Obama and the Democrats, they tend to lean toward the United States being part of it, right? And that seems to be a consistent difference, right? That one wing of the ruling class wants no unity with Europe. It wants the United States to march alone. Another section of the ruling class thinks we need to unify with Europe, and thinks that imperialism is more effective if we play ball with not only Britain, but the United Kingdom, or not only the United Kingdom and Britain, but also France, Germany, etc. So there are differences in the ruling class when it comes to situations like this, the International Criminal Court, the World Health Organization, and the Trump administration has doubled down. And they're using the allegation that somehow, there was a vast conspiracy between China and the World Health Organization to cover up COVID-19. And it's beyond me. I mean, it just shows you the power of American media. The fact that Trump continues, he calls it the Chinese virus, he calls it the Kung flu, the Wuhan virus. Folks, let's talk about the facts here. China had COVID-19 before anyone else. There was not a single country that was openly talking about a COVID-19 outbreak before China. China didn't know what it was. China had to figure out what it was. With no warning, China locked down and defeated COVID-19. And now we're actually starting to see their economies start to expand. Look at the data, right? They have gotten out of the COVID-19 slowdown. China's economy is moving again. They're exporting again. Their GDP is starting to rise again. China beat this. They didn't have any warning. They beat it. Meanwhile, in the United States, they told us everything was going to be okay. Everything's going to be okay. Everything's going to be fine. Don't worry about it. Everything's going to be fine. Everything's going to be okay. Meanwhile, Dianne Feinstein and a lot of politicians in the United States were selling their stocks because they knew it wasn't going to be okay. They were betting against the U.S. economy. They were going, this isn't going to be okay, but let's not tell the commoners. Let's not let the working people know what's really going to happen. They pretended it wasn't going to be a big problem. It hit the country. We hadn't been prepared for it, number one, even though we had plenty of warning. China dealt with it way before we did, first of all. Second of all, they can't manage to get all on the same page about how to deal with it, even now, right? 39 states are seeing a rise in COVID-19 infections. This is a disaster, right? The country's not marching in unison. The right wing has been putting out the notion that if you wear a mask, that means you're a big wimpy and a big sissy, and real men don't wear masks. They go around infecting other people and getting infected themselves. And, a whole bunch of the Trump supporters think it's all a big hoax staged by Bill Gates and the Illuminati. Meanwhile, it's a disaster. So if you look at it, how is COVID-19 an argument against China? That makes no sense. Only in U.S. media does that make any sense. But the Democrats buy it. They don't buy it as much as the Republicans, but the Republicans are really doubling down on this. Tom Cotton is really jumping on this. He's like the flagship anti-China guy. But it's not just them. It's the Democrats. Joe Biden repeats this stuff. Somehow, China getting COVID-19 before anyone else and dealing with it more effectively, despite having no warning, is an argument against China. China tried to warn the rest of the world. China sent protective equipment around the world. China is working with different countries to try and develop a vaccine. China sent aid to Italy. China sent aid to South Korea. How is this an argument against China? I'm just not following this, right? And they say, they didn't alarm the world. No, they did. They did alarm the world. Back in January, you'll recall that Donald Trump said China was doing a heck of a job, right? Donald Trump praised President Xi for how he was handling the pandemic, number one. Number two, American media demonized China for how they were handling it. They said, it's authoritarian. It's authoritarian. They're forcing people to stay indoors. It's the Chinese Communist police state. Well, China beat this. China's economy is already expanding. And meanwhile, over here, people talk about a second wave. It's not a second wave. We haven't dealt with the first wave yet. It's like, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's like, but somehow this is all China's fault. It's all China's fault. China, the country that makes the masks, is somehow responsible for the Trump administration hinting that people shouldn't wear masks and telling them they're big wussies and babies if they wear masks. That's somehow China's fault? No. It's China's fault that Dianne Feinstein and the Democrats and Republicans knew. They got their intelligence briefings and found out how bad it was going to be, and then they got on TV and told Americans, "Don't worry, everything's going to be fine," and then went in the back room and sold their stocks to everybody, and this is going to be bad. Let's head up to the mountains for a few weeks and let the poor people die. That's China's fault. It's China's fault we can't get on the same page about health regulations in this country, that 39 states now are having COVID-19 go up, that New York City, because we've been handling it a little more seriously and we got hit with it, now, we finally had our first day without deaths. Somehow all of this is China's fault. And China dealt with this pretty reasonably. Vietnam, not a single death. Not a single death in socialist Vietnam from COVID-19. Right? Cuba has handled this amazingly well. But Bolsonaro, free market experimenter, disaster. Disaster in Brazil. Again, is it China's fault that the Bolsonaro government basically told people not to worry about it, downplayed it? Is that China's fault? I mean, it's like we're seeing capitalism do what capitalism naturally does. Tell people you're on your own, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Everyone's on their own. You're an individual, right? Right? No one's going to give you a handout. No one's going to, every individual. Capitalism doing what it does best is somehow China's fault. Meanwhile, China actually, what is Shachtman or Crystal, who started out socialist, experienced such bigotry? Oh, okay. We'll talk about that. Yeah. It's Irving Kristol is who you're referring to. Irving Kristol. Military. Alrighty. But yeah, so socialism has been able to very effectively handle this virus. Meanwhile, capitalism has been crashing and burning, and that's why you should hate the biggest socialist country in the world, China. That's what American media would have you believe. Now, there you go. There you go. I mean, that's all there is to it, huh? American media is very, very good at taking things that are very, very obviously true and completely turning them on their heads, right? And they would have you believe that one of the greatest humanitarian disasters in history, the fall of the Soviet Union, was a good thing. I mean, people believed that the fall of the Soviet Union was a good thing. It resulted in mass death. It resulted in mass unemployment, huge rise in sex trafficking, huge rise in drug addiction, the population of Russia between 1992 and 2006 went down by 10%. 6.6 million people either died or left the country. You want to talk about a man-made famine? The Boris Yeltsin administration, in bed with Wall Street and Jeffrey Sachs and the IMF and the World Bank, looting the country, destroying Russia's economy, wrecking its food system, wrecking its industrial base, just destroying Russia. The free market experiment that was carried out in Russia in the 1990s was an epic disaster. But mainstream media, and I remember this, I was a kid at the time, had us all convinced that somehow Russia was better off, that the 1990s was a great time in Russia because they were free. They were free, and they were shooting off fireworks and drinking champagne. They were free, right? There was an epic humanitarian disaster going on, and that's provable. There's BBC documentaries about it. There's all kinds of economic statistics available. This is like an undisputed fact that Russia was experiencing a huge humanitarian catastrophe. Anders Gunder Frank, who was a well-respected Chicago school economist, called it economic genocide, right? But somehow, American media had us all convinced the 1990s was just this amazing time in Russia's history. Well, it's kind of like the situation right now. Somehow, American media has convinced us that the current situation with COVID-19 somehow logically leads to Chinese Communist Party bad. I don't know how that works. The logic isn't there. But facts don't really matter when you've got an ideological narrative. Now, do they? All right. Iran set a fire at a nuclear facility in Natanz, caused significant damage. It did not say what caused the blaze, but spooks in the region believe it was a bomb. Suspicion has fallen on Israel and America, which have sabotaged Iran's nuclear program in the past. Other mysterious incidents, including the recent explosions at power plants and factories, remain unexplained. Well, there's a lot of things I could say about that. First of all, the Islamic Republic of Iran has been under attack since it had its revolution in 1979, since it toppled the U.S.-backed dictatorship of the Shah Since it set up the Islamic Republic and began reorganizing society and the economy on principles of not capitalism but Islam, neither East nor West, war of poverty against wealth. You can talk about it from that angle, and the economic warfare and sanctions that have been imposed on the Islamic Republic of Iran ever since then. The fact that the USA, backed Iraq in invading Iran at some points, and then at other points it kind of gave some passive support to Iran to fight against Iraq, and tried to play two anti-imperialist countries against each other, resulting in at least 1 million deaths in the Iraq-Iran war. You can talk about a lot of things, but there's other things too that you can talk about. For example, this is not the first time the Iranian nuclear program, the peaceful nuclear energy program of Iran, has been targeted. Right? Iran is a signatory of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Every nuclear power plant in Iran is monitored completely by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, because under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, if you have nuclear power, it must be monitored at all times to make sure that that you are not trying to make a nuclear weapon. Every facility is completely video surveilled. There is no way that Iran could be taking plutonium or uranium out of there and trying to make a bomb out of it. You just couldn't do it, right? Now, the Mujahideen Khalq, the crazy Iranian fanatics, tried to tell us they had a picture of a safe where Iran was, had their nuclear secrets or whatever. And it turned out they had gotten the picture from a safe website. It was very quickly revealed that this picture of a safe that they had gone to Google Images and typed in safe. And it was one of the first things that came up. And they looked like a bunch of fools. But that didn't stop American media from believing them for the first couple days. And that next time they come up with a BS report, Nord Stream 2, right. U.S. I heard that. Okay, Browder and Foster. Wow. Okay. But I want to talk about another aspect of this Iran situation, which is that in addition to being against the Islamic Republic of Iran, they're against nuclear power also. Bet you didn't know that. But nuclear power is a threat to big oil. It represents the potential of getting humanity off of fossil fuels. And for a long time, big oil has been trying to crush nuclear power. In fact, one of the main reasons that there is a big rivalry between the United States and France historically is because France, in 1974, realized that having to depend on Britain and the United States and their oil monopolists for fuel was a weakness. So in 1974, France got really into nuclear energy. 75% of the electricity in France comes from nuclear power. And in fact, France is able to generate quite a bit of money for its public budget by exporting nuclear power, the energy, the electricity they produce. And in the 70s, France worked with the government of Iraq to develop peaceful nuclear energy. They built some nuclear power plant facilities in Iraq. And what happened? Well, the Israelis bombed and destroyed their nuclear power facility and killed 10 Iraqis. And on top of that, they killed a French citizen, right? France is a big supporter of nuclear power, nuclear energy, because they don't want to be dependent on Britain and the United States, which control the international oil markets. France has Total, but Total is not enough to really be fully independent. What's also interesting is that, the Israelis murdered Iranian nuclear scientists. And I actually went to their graves in Tehran. There were 5 scientists, science professors, nuclear physicists, who were teaching at the university, and they were helping Iran's peaceful nuclear energy program. And they were killed. One of them was just walking to class to speak to his students, and he was walking down the street, and someone walked up to him with a gun, and kaboom, blew him away. Right? 5. American economy has already crashed for COVID-19. Isn't that a case of distracting? Oh, okay. We'll talk about that. And, 5 nuclear scientists were murdered for trying to run Iran's nuclear power plants. They were killed in collaboration between the Mossad and the Mujahideen Khalq terrorist organization, the MEK. And they killed 5 nuclear scientists. And I actually visited their sites. I have a picture. If you go way back in my social media, you can find pictures of me with their graves. It's very horrendous. Nuclear power represents the way out of the world being controlled by the Wall Street and London oil monopolists, and they don't like it. And they don't like the fact that France was working with countries around the world to develop, and they don't like the fact that Germany has tried to pursue nuclear energy. And that's the basis of a lot of the divides between the European mainland and the 2 Atlanticist superpowers, Britain and the United States. And that's interesting right now, as we'll get to Nord Stream 2, because... thank you for the super chat. I'll just lay it out there. So Nord Stream 2 is a natural gas pipeline being constructed by Gazprom, which is the state-controlled energy corporation that is at the center of Russia's economy. It's a national champion. Vladimir Putin made Gazprom and Rosneft into, state-controlled mega corporations to reboot the Russian economy. He did this in the early years of the 20th century. It was very successful. It got Russia out of the nightmare caused by the fall of the Soviet Union. So now Germany is trying to, start importing more and more Russian natural gas. And in response to that, we've had sanctions imposed by the United States. And Nord Stream 2 pipeline is going to bring a lot more natural gas into European Union countries from Russia. And the United States has been determined to kill Nord Stream 2. And they're calling this natural gas pipeline class reductionism. They're calling this natural gas pipeline, they're calling it malign influence by Russia. And they are determined to try and force Germany to import natural gas, not from Russia, which is right next to it, but all the way from the United States. The White House actually has policies calling for what they refer to as energy dominance. Energy dominance. That is the White House program. They want fracking companies in the United States to be supplying Germany with natural gas. And it's ridiculous, and the Germans are outraged about it, and they don't want to take it. And the European Union doesn't want to take it, and it's ridiculous demand. It is absolutely ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous to try and tell Germany they can't buy Russian natural gas. Instead, they should buy natural gas all the way across the Atlantic Ocean from the United States. Do you know how much more expensive it will be per liter? It's a ridiculous demand. But apparently Russia is bad, according to Mike Pompeo, so you shouldn't buy their gas. That's basically the argument. They're making a moral argument, right? You should pay twice as much for your natural gas because Russia bad, as if the United States has never done anything bad. And that seems to be the situation. And again, now that Britain is out of the European Union, the U.S. left will be able to pressure Biden. Okay. Pressure Biden, U.S. left. So the question is with Britain outside of the European Union, is there going to be more independence on the part of France, Germany, Belgium, Luxembourg, and other countries that make up the EU? Are they going to be more independent now? And will they begin to wonder and ask themselves if going against Russia and going against China is really in their interests overall? Right? It's very possible. We could be at the beginning of a big division between the imperialist countries. Let's remember that World War I and World War II, and thank you, Nick, World War I and World War II were both really about this question. Right? If you watch the movie Reds with Warren Beatty, at one point he says, "Don't you understand that Britain and America run the world? Germany just wants a piece of it." And that's kind of the situation. Germany did not become a nation state and a full-on Western capitalist country until 1851, right? In 1848, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and Richard Wagner and every German you ever heard of revolted, and they rose up demanding the creation of a German nation state, a democratic republic. They were called Republicans, Red Republicans. That was the Marxists. They were the Socialist Republicans. They were Democratic Republicans. They were nationalists. There were others. The 1848 German Revolution completely failed. It wasn't until 1851 that Germany really, ultimately started to move in the direction of having a nation state. 1848 revolution failed. Germany was very, very late in the game, very, very late in the game to becoming a full-on nation state, and especially late in the game into becoming an imperialist country. They did have colonies. They did have overseas markets. They had parts of Africa and Asia that they controlled, no question about it. They were pretty late in the game. And World War I was basically Germany teaming up with the Habsburg Austrian monarchy, with the Ottoman Empire, and trying to fight for control of the colonial world against Britain, the United States, and France. The Germans lost. They were stripped of their colonies at the end of World War I. And they became indebted to American banks and British banks. So then, later, we remember that there was a individual named Adolf Hitler, who basically carried out a Bonapartist coup on behalf of the German industrial capitalists Krupp, Thyssen, and a German banker by the name of Hallemer Schacht, and they seized control of the government in 1933. And once again, Germany was trying to become an imperialist country, once again seizing territory, etc. The Second World War then broke out. There was a division among the ruling class. Some of the ruling class thought they should let Germany become an imperialist power again because it would destroy the Soviet Union. Others in the ruling class thought that Germany was more of a threat than the Soviet Union. There was a big divide. But ultimately, World War II broke out, and once again, Germany was stripped of its colonies. And that Germany has never really been allowed to become part of the imperialist club. They haven't been. They tried. They very much tried, but they've never really been allowed to be part of the imperialist club. And that there is an underlying resentment. There are a lot of wealthy bankers and imperialists in Germany, in Frankfurt and the finance houses and such. There's a lot of them. And there is a resentment on their part. And, for example, if you go to the Islamic Republic of Iran, there is only one foreign car that you will see on the streets. And what is it? It's a BMW, a German car. You go to Venezuela, they have outlets there for their electricity. And they are the German outlets. They are the two holes, the two circular holes. That's what they have. You'll see Thyssen products in buildings, right? The elevators will be run by Thyssen. And wherever you go, in China especially, in countries, protests in Serbia and Bulgaria, in countries that tend to be on the outs with the U.S. imperialists, you tend to see a lot of German business. And this division, this underlying division that laid the basis for World War I and World War II, it's starting to gradually reassert itself. And this Nord Stream 2 situation is a great example of that. Now, it seems like European countries have been much more willing to cooperate with the United States and block Huawei technologies, right? The United Kingdom just announced it, but other European countries seem to be willing to go along with the USA in its efforts to destroy Huawei, the Chinese state-controlled telecommunications manufacturer. But this notion that the Germans should be forced to buy their natural gas from the United States rather than from Russia, it's not going over too well. And again, this underlying division, this feeling that Germany and maybe even France, maybe even Belgium, maybe even a lot of the European mainland doesn't really have a future aligning with Britain and the United States, that underlying tension and belief may once again be reasserting itself. We may see more and more of that develop, because what happens is when you have a capitalist crisis, which we're experiencing right now, a crisis of overproduction and the falling rate of profit, when that happens, there are divisions among the ruling class. Azerbaijan, Armenia, So, what else? Gunmen killed 8 construction workers building Africa's largest gas project in northern Mozambique. A growing jihadist insurgency in the country has claimed more than 1,000 lives since 2017. Folks, what is the fountainhead? Let's back up. Folks, what is the ideology that drives jihadist terrorism? It's called Wahhabism. It is a particular brand of Sunni Islam that is so extreme, it rejects the idea of a democratic government. It's attempting to restore, a caliphate from the 1400s. It is Salafism, Wahhabism, Takfirism. And where does that ideology come from? Does it come from the sky? Does it come from the trees? Does it sometimes grow? It comes from Saudi Arabia. And why, may I ask, would Saudi Arabia not be interested in seeing a large gas project in Mozambique? Mozambique, country in southern Africa, country whose origins are in a Marxist revolution. SWAPO, or no, that's in Namibia. But Mozambique's history, right? Mozambique came into existence as a result of anti-colonial struggles and anti-fascist struggles in Europe. And Mozambique's history is, Mozambique emerged as a country because of Marxist, anti-imperialist groups and, groups aligned with the Soviet Union and China in southern Africa, like Zimbabwe, like Namibia, like South Africa. And Mozambique is building a natural gas construction project. And it just so happens that some people armed with the ideology of Saudi Arabia, a country that is basically the oil plantation of Wall Street in London, go and attack it. Now, folks, I'm not gonna get specific here. I'm not saying that the king of Saudi Arabia made a phone call and said, "Hey, terrorists, can you go attack?" That's not what happened. Is there an imperialistic fight to divide up the Middle East between the U.S., British, and France, and now Israel? Oh, okay. Writing it down. That's not what I'm saying. So don't misrepresent what I'm saying. There's no grand conspiracy here. That's not how the world works. There's no grand conspiracy here. Yemen. No grand conspiracy. Thanks, David. Yemen. No grand conspiracy. There's no plot. There's no sinister, it's not like there's a cabal or, somebody sitting high up on a thing that's high up on a thing and they're like plotting. That's not what's going on here. What's going on here is that Wall Street and London maintain their monopoly by keeping the world poor so that they can stay rich, by beating down any independent country and maintaining control specifically of the energy markets, oil and gas. And Saudi Arabia is a key linchpin of their empire. Thank you, true audience. And China, on the other hand, and Russia, and Marxists and socialists and anti-imperialists, Bolivarians, Shia Muslims, Baathists, anti-colonial fighters of all stripes, revolutionaries, anti-capitalists, Russia, China, would like to rattle that world order and raise people out of poverty and restructure the global economy on the basis of win-win cooperation. So that the situation is no longer countries trading with each other so that one country gets poorer while the other country gets richer, but rather a new structure of global trade based on win-win cooperation, right? An end to imperialism, an end to the super exploitation of developing countries. That's what Russia and China and various anti-imperialists around the world are striving for. And so part of that has been Russia and China helping countries like Mozambique and Angola and South Africa and Namibia and many countries around the developing world to develop their own industries, their own mining, their own natural gas, their own oil manufacturing. And so is it surprising that people armed with the ideology of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia conveniently show up to engage in terrorism to try and overthrow governments that are engaged in that process, whether it's in Mozambique, whether it's in Angola, whether it's in Syria, whether it's in Libya? I mean, we know that starting in the 1970s, Zbigniew Brzezinski started working with a young Saudi by the name of Osama bin Laden to destabilize Afghanistan, to keep Afghanistan poor, and to stop the Soviet Union from building schools and hospitals in Afghanistan, to stop the Soviet Union from helping the people of Afghanistan to develop their own, agricultural system. Soviet troops were in Afghanistan plowing the fields. The Soviet Union was sending tractors to Afghanistan. The Soviet Union wanted to stabilize Afghanistan, to have stability in Central Asia, to have stability on their own border. So Zbigniew Brzezinski got together with Osama bin Laden, and they launched a jihad against the Afghan Democratic Republic. And that was in 1978 and 79. Now, we also know that the United States has worked with Islamic extremists and Wahhabis and terrorists to violently overthrow the government of Libya, right? Libya, another country, independent, used its state-run energy corporations to raise people up out of poverty. Well, the U.S. government worked with all kinds of jihadists and terrorists and extremists to tear down socialism in Libya. In Syria, another country that was making a deal with Iran to build a pipeline, an oil pipeline to the Mediterranean, had a deal with China to start developing its natural gas. Jihadists come along, backed by the United States, to tear it down. So now we look at this situation in Mozambique, a country that began with an independence struggle led by a Marxist-Leninist party. 8 gunmen kill 8 construction workers. A jihadist insurgency takes 1,000 lives since 2017. I think you know what's going on here. As Nigeria has started to move in the direction of being friendlier to China, we've seen the rise of Boko Haram and the military strongman of Buhari installed. Folks, once you understand the world, once you have the method of dialectical and historical materialism, you can understand how these things seem to work. The world starts to make a lot more sense than it once did. Now, there's a few other news items here from The Economist. Don't worry, I want to get to all your super chats. They're all very, very important, and you will get an answer from me. You may not like the answer that you get. Sina, which in 2000 became the first Chinese internet company to list on the NASDAQ, received an offer from Charles Chow, its chairman and CEO, to take it private. That prompted speculation about the possibility of other Chinese tech firms exiting the American stock market to escape any forthcoming regulatory clampdown that targets Chinese firms. Yep. Furthermore, United Airlines sent notices to 36,000 employees warning that their jobs could be at risk when federal support for the aviation industry stops. This list includes 2,250 pilots. The hopes of airlines for a small improvement in travel have been dashed by the new surge of COVID-19 cases in America, which now tops 3 million. Thoughts on Chinese land acquisition in Africa? Okay. Africa. Well, folks, that's the situation. That's capitalism. Turkey's stock exchange banned 6 foreign banks, including Barclays, Credit Suisse, Goldman Sachs, and betting against the Turkish share prices. The country's market regulator had only just lifted the short-selling restrictions on the biggest companies. Turkey's latest action fits a pattern of interfering in the markets. Oh, God forbid that. such as temporarily excluding 3 foreign banks from trading in lira earlier this week, right? Turkey is moving in a more independent direction. Erdogan is a bit of a Bonapartist strongman, kind of like Modi, kind of like Duterte, and the USA doesn't like him taking measures to control the economy. That was my roundup from The Economist, right? Giving you the commentary in the background to help you understand what's happening in the world economy with Caleb Maupin. Thanks for joining me. Well, folks, the world is constantly in a state of change. A does not equal A. The first A can never be the same as the second A because the world is constantly in motion. All that exists is matter, but that matter is constantly in a state of change. Dialectical materialism. There's so much that I could say today, and I will later. I'm actually going to give some comments about socialism and how people keep going during hard times. I'm going to give some more inspirational comments later in the conversation, but we spent a long time on our introduction. So on that note, I think that we're going to do our roll call, and I'll call you out as I see you, and then we're going to start going through these super chats. So if you have not yet sent a super chat, please go ahead. If you would like to just support us and don't want to bother with a super chat, you can always go below and become a Patreon sponsor. And on that note, folks, I am going to take a sip of orange juice and start calling you out names and locations. Robert from Hawaii. Will there be a conflict within the Balkans with China's... Okay. Robert from Hawaii. Conflict in the Balkans. Robert from Hawaii. Dallas, Texas, Longworn. David in Wisconsin. Nick from Louisiana. Alex won't say. DC, Dust James. UK, Sammy Jabber. Robert Persona. Los Angeles, Cleveland. Hi from Virginia. Madrid, Spain. Michigan, Clark. Hello from Richmond, Virginia. Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Dante from Southern California. JT24, Vicksburg. What is a cryptofash? Okay, I'll write it down. Cryptofash. Liverpool, UK. New Orleans. Aaron. Ken from Connecticut. Vancouver. Alexander in Perth, Australia. Phoenix, Arizona. Armpit of the United States. Ithaca, New York. Michael. Joanne in the Netherlands. Bangor, Maine, USA. Helen Woolley. Hi, Caleb in Melbourne, Australia. Vosh. Chicago Island. Chicago-ish. Richmond, Virginia. Enrique, Newark, New Jersey. Majory, Ohio. Just received my copy of City Builders and Vandals. Enjoy it. Enjoy it. Mark Shear in North Carolina. Georgia, Chan. Mid-Hudson, New York. Deutschland Democratic Republic. South Korea, Alan Reyes. Welcome, welcome. Welcome, welcome. Cincinnati. Lily from Atlanta. Welcome, welcome. Vallejo, California. Jason Sarna. Ocean Springs, Mississippi. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Akeem in the Netherlands. Los Angeles got a copy of Getting Rich Without Capitalism last week. Enjoy the book. Enjoy the book, Paragus. Dublin, Lazy Bones. Looking forward to the Green Book, says Nubulk. Long Island, New York, Will Lotz. Clydebank, Scotland. Norway. Well, it's my way or Norway. Springfield, Missouri. Florida, unfortunately. Julian from Melbourne. Greater Toronto area. Hit the like button. I think Maupin fan followers need a name. Well, call yourself whatever you want. Heathrow. Spencer Richards. Israel. Calvin from Saskatoon. Pomona, California. Bendigo, Australia. David Fox is with us. Texas, Robinson, Texas. Mopheads. Kinky is with us. Kinky is with us. Huey Long is with us. Harold Sullivan in Florida. JT24 in Louisiana. Belize. Joey from Belize. Belize. Springfield, Missouri. Lethbridge, Alberta, Canada. Tuning in from South Louisiana, says Jacob Maxey. Joseph Maupin in New Zealand. Are you a relative of mine, Joseph? I don't recall any relatives by that name, but maybe we just have the same last name. Mohsin from Iran. Chan got my green book a few days ago. Enjoyed your introduction. I'm glad you liked it, Chan. It's a great book. And we've already gotten hundreds of them out. I am blown away. Oahu, Hawaii. Yeah, great. Welcome, folks out in Hawaii. Good stuff. Alrighty. Any other names and locations before we move on and start tackling the super chats? I'm always happy to answer your super chats. Like I said, I will not give you always the answer that you want. I'm in Utah. Dan Brito. Anybody else as I drink? Will there be a patrons-only stream soon? That's the plan. We're going to have a patrons-only stream every month, so only patrons will know about it. But yes, there's going to be one. South Dakota, Max W. Alrighty. Alrighty, folks. The Iran-China deal. Right? Iran and China are on the brink of signing a 25-year military and economic partnership. This is in response to both countries being, attacked by the United States economically. Iran far more so than China, but China pretty harshly in recent months. I don't know if folks saw. The United States is considering banning all members of the Chinese Communist Party from entering the country. A travel ban on all Chinese Communist Party members. That would include Jack Ma of Alibaba, for example, right? I mean, there's 90 million members of the party. Some of the most important people in China, college professors, academics, celebrities are party members. So there you go. But Iran and China are getting closer. I saw this. I actually wrote an essay. When I was in Iran, I saw the large amount of Chinese investment. I actually wrote an essay called The Great Satan and the Silk Road. You can read it online, and it was based on what I saw in Iran in 2014 and 2015 about China's role in Iran and the influence of China in Iran and Iran's relationship and kind of the similarities in the country's history. And yes, the anti-imperialist camp is going to become more explicitly anti-imperialist, no doubt about it. Take a listen to some of the stuff that Xi Jinping has been saying lately. And yes, there's going to be an increase. Could Russia turn in a socialist direction after Putin leaves office? I believe Putin becomes far-right. All right, I'm going to write that down. Russia post Putin. All righty. So yeah, I mean, the Iran-China deal is pointing toward the fact, but, look at Iran-Venezuela relations, for example. Venezuela, right? Now they have an Iranian supermarket. Iran and Venezuela are getting economically closer to each other. So, that's what happens. It used to be that if the United States didn't trade with you, you were done. You were screwed. Well, now the United States wants to lock you out economically. Okay, you trade with Russia, you trade with Iran, you trade with Venezuela. It's not really a good strategy for the United States to just block people off, because there is a rising economy developing in the global south that is not under the control of the imperialists. There is independent economic development going on, and the imperialists are unable to stop it. All right. Socialism and animal rights. Well, let me first say that cruelty to animals is demented. Cruelty to animals is often associated with cruelty to people. Many psychopaths, the kind of people that become school shooters or serial killers often torture animals as children. Is Scooby-Doo related to the synthetic left? That's an interesting one. I never thought in a million years I would get a question like that. Scooby-Doo, synthetic left. I will give you an answer. Stay tuned. But yes, animal rights and socialism. So, cruelty to animals, completely unacceptable. Completely unacceptable. When people are being cruel to animals, it's usually a sign that they lack basic empathy. Right? They lack the ability to have compassion on some level. It is a bad sign. And, you can talk about factory farming and some of the things that go on. A lot of the things that PETA points out are not good. So no one here will ever defend cruelty to animals. I will never try to tell you cruelty to animal doesn't matter, that it's just something we should look aside, because when you see cruelty to animals, you're going to see cruelty to people pretty soon. They're linked. And it reflects a lack of empathy, kind of cruelty, a sadism, an inability to have empathy for other people, and other animals, right? It's no A rational person doesn't want to hurt a puppy, doesn't want to hurt a kitty, doesn't want to hurt a cow or cruelty to animals is linked to a bigger problem. So cruelty to animals, not okay. That said, I am not a believer in the concept of animal rights, because rights are by definition things that belong to humans. Um, Sorry if that's a tough pill to swallow, but can animals vote? Of course they can. Can animals run for office? No. Can animals be imprisoned against their will? Yes. Can animals, be, turned into food? Yes. Rights are by definition human. Cruelty to animals is bad, and I would never support it. And if people want to be vegans, I support their right to do that. I'm not a vegan personally, but I don't, and there are just some things about we can talk about capitalism and the way, I'll give you an example, right? I'll give you an example. In my little town, I grew up in a very small town in Ohio, and there was a chicken plant in my town. It was called, I don't want to say the name because they could sue me. So I'm not going to say the name of the chicken plant in my town. It may not even be there anymore. But when I was a kid, there was a chicken plant in my town. And a lot of people I knew worked there. And they would always tell you, you would not believe what is in our chicken plant. And I'd say, what do you mean? They'd say, it's not a chicken. And they would always say, if you work at this chicken plant, this chicken process, this poultry processing plant, the animal that is in those cages is not a chicken. It has no feathers, number one. It can't walk. It's this weird genetically engineered creature made to be food on your plate. And people would be in shock. They assumed that, when you eat chicken, it used to be, something that walks around the barnyard going bok bok and having feathers and such, and then they kill it, and then you eat it. But at this poultry processing plant, everyone who worked there would make you very, very clear that the creature that was in that cage, that was pumped full of steroids, that was bred not to have, feathers and all that, was not a chicken. And it was like a shocking thing for people when they would work in this plant. They would be shocked that, we're basically breeding these creatures for eating, and they don't look anything like what a chicken looks like. They're this specially bred, strange, pumped up with steroids, made to be more fattening, preservatives. And you got to say, as much as science is not subject to human opinion, right? It doesn't matter what I think. I'm not a scientist. There's just a part of me that says, this clump of flesh sitting in a cage that looks nothing like a chicken, that can't be healthy to eat. There's nothing to do about it. If you ever eat chicken, that's what you're eating in the United States. If you go to the store, you go to a restaurant, you cook it at home, you get a rotisserie chicken from what you're eating is not a chicken, right? You've seen chickens in movies. Those chickens lay eggs. They actually look like chickens. But the kind of chickens that are processed in poultry plants to eat, they don't look like chickens. That can't be healthy. It's cruelty to animals, number one, but it's also can't be healthy. So, I'm not ever saying that cruelty to animals is a good thing. I'm not saying that what goes on in factory farms is a good thing. I'm just objecting to the term. I don't think the term animal rights is correct, because rights are by definition human. Animals cannot vote. Animals don't get a trial if they're accused of crimes. They don't get convicted of crimes because they're animals. You know what I mean? I think you can be morally opposed to cruelty to animals. You can recognize that cruelty to animals is unethical, is something that society should oppose, number one, but also not believe in the concept of animal rights because it is somewhat of an illogical concept. I don't accept the concept of animal rights. So that was my rant about that. Okay. I have not followed the Great Reset, so I don't want to address it in the wrong way. So I will look into that because I think I have a feeling about what they're talking about, but I don't want to say the wrong thing. So I'm gonna take a rain check on that. I will get back to that, but I can't give you a direct, full, thorough answer now. My answer is I haven't looked into it enough. All right, Barry Weiss resignation. Awful. Is the American empire descending like Rome due to unpayable debt? All right, writing it down. American empire, Rome, question mark. All right, Barry Weiss is awful. I mean, she's awful. I mean, the kind of things she says. I mean, she's anti-left wing. I mean, she was big into pushing the idea that Jeremy Corbyn was a raving anti-Semite, and I mean, she's awful in a lot of ways. Max Blumenthal wrote an interesting article about her resignation and asking the question if she did it just to get more publicity for herself. And yeah, I'm not a big fan of Barry Weiss. Not a big fan of Barry Weiss. And that's about all the attention she deserves. There you go. Okay. Eurasian infrastructure projects. Well, what are Eurasian infrastructure projects about? They're about the fact that the United States and the IMF and the World Bank, when they trade with a country, what they do is they go into that country and they mandate privatizations. They require them to cut the government budget, to reduce the amount of taxes that companies have to pay, lift all their tariffs, and basically gut the public sector. Right? If you trade with the United States, they're going to ask you to fire public workers, to stop building infrastructure, stop funding your power plants, stop delivering the garbage. Right? They're going to impose free market reforms on you. When Russia and China trade with a country, they do the opposite. They tend to inflate the public sector. They tend to give you a loan to build a new hospital, to build a new school, to build a new highway, to build a new airport. They tend to pump up the infrastructure of your economy, whereas the United States tends to gut the infrastructure and the public sector of your economy. And as a result, countries that trade with Russia and China, their domestic economy flourishes because when you have better roads in your country, your economy does better. When you have more hospitals and power plants and stuff, your economy does better. And that's good for Russia because Russia and China have more to trade with. And it's good for that country because their economy is getting better. And it's win-win cooperation. That's when Russia and China trade with a country. When the United States trades with a country, they gut the public sector. The domestic economy gets poorer, and that's okay because then they become more and more dependent on purchasing products from the United States, and they become poorer and poorer and poorer, which means they become a client state where they stop producing their own products and have to buy everything from the West. Their domestic economy shrinks and shrinks and shrinks, and Western corporations dominate it. That's the difference. So the reason that Russia and China are going around the world and building infrastructure is because it basically makes clear why it's better to trade with them. Russia and China trade with you and build infrastructure. The United States trades with you, and it makes all your infrastructure fall apart. The basis of socialism in Venezuela, the beginning of the rise of Hugo Chavez, was the Caracazo. What was the Caracazo in Venezuela about? Well, it was a huge riot in Venezuela, in Caracas, in the capital, and it was caused by the fact that the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank were basically forcing Venezuela to cut all the funding for its public transportation system. Right? Because they said, you got to reduce public spending. You can't be hiring all these transit workers and all that. So the price of getting on the public transportation system that many Caracans, or residents of Caracas required to get to work, it went way up. And as a result of that, they went out and they protested and rioted, and there were protests and all of that. In Bolivia, the rise of Evo Morales was in response to the fact that the government of Bolivia, under the direction of the IMF and the World Bank and Jeffrey Sachs, they were basically selling their water. They were privatizing their water resources out of desperation. They were, selling off their water to American corporations. And that this is what neoliberalism and trade with Western capitalist countries does. Russia and China do the opposite. So when you're asking about Eurasian infrastructure projects, that's what you're getting at. Okay, you were asked about the military. Okay, so about Irving Kristol. So who is Irving Kristol? Okay, Irving Kristol was a Trotskyite. He was a follower of Max Shachtman. Max Shachtman was a Trotskyist. He was one of the most prominent Trotskyists in the United States. Big American Trotskyist, founding member of the Communist Party USA, agreed with Trotsky, opposed Stalin. So he started, he was part of the Trotskyist movement. And then in 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was signed. 1939, The Soviet Union had gone to all the Western capitalist countries to try and sign an anti-fascist treaty, to have an alliance against the Nazis. They got flat turned down by the United States, flat turned down by Britain. France agreed for a while and then stabbed him in the back and betrayed it. So after a while, the Soviet Union figured, okay, we have no choice. We have to sign a treaty with Nazi Germany. And so they signed the 1939 Non-Aggression Pact. They drew a line down the center of Europe and they said, Germany's army won't go on this side, Soviet army won't go on this side. It was the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And immediately after that pact was signed, the U.S. media started playing up the idea that communists and Nazis were the same. It was a big theme in American media. Communists and Nazis are the same. Time magazine, New York Times, they were all running this line. And a lot of Trotskyites agreed with that, including Max Shachtman. Trotsky did not agree with that. Trotsky did not agree. Trotsky maintained the Soviet Union was a deformed workers' state. Max Shachtman, on the other hand, said that the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany were not socialist. They were not workers' states. They were bureaucratic collectivism. They were state capitalism. That was Max Shachtman's break with Trotsky. Interesting side note. There's a stupid song that the Trotskyites made up about the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of 1939. Up in Moscow, in the Kremlin, in the fall of 39, there's a Russian and a Prussian riding up the party line. Leon Trotsky was a Nazi, oh, we knew that for a fact. Pravda said it, we all read it, until the Stalin-Hitler pact. Yeah, it was the stupidest song. You can look up the rest of it. Leon Trotsky, once a Nazi, that was then the party line, but now the Nazis are hotsy-totsy, and Trotsky's setting British minds. It's the stupidest thing. But anyway, so 1939, Shachtman is the leader of the Trotskyists that break with Trotsky over the Soviet question. Trotsky maintains Soviet Union is still socialist, it just has a quote-unquote Stalinist bureaucracy. Whereas Shachtman maintains the Soviet Union is bureaucratic collectivism, state capitalism. So Shachtman, is kicked out and he starts his own group. It's called the Workers' Party, eventually the Independent Socialist League. One of the lower level members of Shachtman's group is Irving Kristol, right? And he's just this Trotskyist writer. Well, Irving Kristol got drafted into the U.S. military. And you can go read his New York Times obituary. He says this, okay? Can you compare Bukharin and Deng Xiaoping? Oh, okay. His obituary, it says in his obituary, he got drafted into the U.S. military, and he had been a Shachtmanite socialist, but then he met other Americans in the U.S. military and considered them to be like barbarians and inferior. And he said, I believe the quote is, I can't build socialism with these people. They'll make a racket out of it, or something like that. Read his New York Times obituary. I've quoted it in articles before. I'm quoting it in my new book. Irving Kristol, basically based on the fact that he was no longer an intellectual bohemian in New York City and suddenly was in the army with actual working class people, he hated working class people. He thought they were inferior rabble. So based on that, he stopped being a socialist. After the Second World War, the CIA hired him. They hired him to run the Congress for Cultural Freedom program, which was the CIA's attempt to manipulate leftism. And what's interesting is Irving Kristol, he becomes the director of the Congress for Cultural Freedom program of the CIA. What's interesting is he maintains he stopped being a socialist during the war. But a lot of Shachtmanites, who are still calling themselves socialists, in fact, it was almost all Shachtmanites. It was like lots of these Shachtmanites got hired by the CIA. Irving Howe, he was a very prominent Shachtmanite. Irving Howe became a very, prominent figure in the Congress for Cultural Freedom. Shachtman himself, was tied to it. Mary McCarthy, Hannah Arendt, who hung out with the Shachtmanites. All of these Shachtmanites became like CIA leftists. And one of the main themes of their writing was equating the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany. And that was a big theme in Hannah Arendt's writing. And that was a big theme in a lot of their writing, was the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany are the same. That was like one of their big themes. And they were paid by the CIA to put out that crap and to, just put out there. The Soviet Union and the Nazis are just the same, right? And blah, blah, blah. That was a big thing. But what's interesting is that Irving Kristol, his career doesn't end there. So he's running the Congress for Cultural Freedom in the 1950s. He's running the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is this socialist left-wing operation run by the CIA. But in the 60s, the anti-Vietnam War protest movement starts. The Black Panthers come along. He hates them, right? He's an anti-communist, right? He hates them. So the Democrats kind of are a little more friendly to the anti-Vietnam War protesters, friendlier to the Black liberation struggle. So Irving Kristol becomes a conservative. And Irving Kristol is considered to be the father of neoconservatism. Irving Kristol, the one-time Shachtmanite Trotskyist, who later became the CIA manipulator of leftism, later then became the father of neoconservatism. Now, the other individual who's named as the father of neoconservatism is Leo Strauss, who was a philosophy professor from Germany who moved to the United States, before the Second World War, was never a leftist of any kind. Leo Strauss was never a leftist. But yeah, that when people talk about the neocon Trotskyist roots, the Trotskyist roots of neoconservatism, it's Shachtmanism. The followers of Max Shachtman, a lot of them, like Irving Kristol, after World War II, started working with the CIA and Partisan Review magazine. And from there, they started becoming neocons. It's very bizarre, very, very bizarre. Yeah. Alrighty. All right, I already addressed the European Union and Nord Stream 2. The European Union is taking a stand. I mean, it is absolutely ridiculous on the part of the United States to try and demand that Germany buy their natural gas from the United States, not Russia. All right. Browder and Foster, ideological disagreements. Well, here's the thing. All right, so William Z. Foster, he was the American communist. William Z. Foster, he's the leader of the Steel Strike of 1919, very prominent American trade unionist. William Z. Foster eventually, joins the Communist Party. In the 1920s, there were two factions in the Communist Party USA. There was the faction led by J. Lovestone, and there was the faction led by William Z. Foster. Now, Earl Browder was with William Z. Foster. They were in the same faction. J. Lovestone was against William Z. Foster. In 1928, they had a convention, and there was the 6th Congress of the Communist International, and J. Lovestone was kicked out for American exceptionalism. J. Lovestone maintained that Marxist economics doesn't apply to the United States. The USA is exceptional, and that Marxist, historical materialism doesn't apply to the USA because it's just such an amazing capitalist economy or whatever. He's kicked out of the Communist Party. So the Foster faction starts to lead the Communist Party, and William Z. Foster is the chairman of the Communist Party, and Earl Browder becomes the general secretary. But then in 1932, William Z. Foster is campaigning for president. He's going from all over the United States. Everywhere he goes, he gets beaten up by the police and tortured, and his campaign of 1932 sounds like the most. Those of us who think we have stressful activism lives. William Z. Foster's presidential campaign of 1932 was a really, really, really stressful thing. Like everywhere he went, he was arrested and beaten up and tortured, and and he went to every corner of the United States pushing his presidential campaign. Actually got like 100,000 votes, I think, at least, or maybe 60,000, something like that. He got a decent number of votes. He wrote Towards Soviet America, which is a very good book, which was like the manifesto of his 1932 election campaign. Towards Soviet America. The slogan is Revolutionary Way Out of the Crisis. But after that 1932 presidential campaign, William Z. Foster had a heart attack. So he was forced to go to the Soviet Union. You ever seen The Death of Stalin? All right. So he was forced to go to the Soviet Union to recover from his heart attack. So Earl Browder he was the general secretary, started to be the leader of the Communist Party. Now, Earl Browder was from Kansas, which is, a Midwestern farming state. He was a very low-income person from Kansas, and his father had been a socialist, and his father encouraged his... Tony Cliff, wow, okay. His father encouraged his two sons to to not fight in World War I. So Earl Browder, refused to fight, and so his two sons went to federal prison because they refused to fight in World War I because it was a capitalist war. So Earl Browder went to federal prison. In federal prison, he learned to be an accountant. Back then, there were not that. This was before mass incarceration, so there weren't that many people in federal prison. So they used to have things like classes in federal prison. So in federal prison, Earl Browder became an accountant. I think he also learned to play the flute in federal prison. Again, back then, federal prison, it was probably worse in terms of, like, they probably, like, flogged people and stuff, but there was a lot more stuff to do in prison. It was a little bit different than it is now. But so he learns to play the flute, and he comes out of prison as an accountant, and he joins up with William Z. Foster, eventually joins the Communist Party, and he becomes, a close collaborator with William Z. Foster in the Communist Party. William Z. Foster is recovering from his heart attack. Earl Browder is kind of the leader of the Communist Party. And Earl Browder is seen as a very, very corrupt bureaucratic politician. Earl Browder is slimy. He just had an awful reputation. And I have actually spoken with people who worked with Earl Browder, very older folks that remember what he was like. In fact, I actually heard the hilarious story that there was somebody who told me that in the 1950s, when they were a teenager, they went to the Soviet Union. They were walking down the street, and an older woman walked up to them and said, "Oh, are you from America?" And they said, "Yeah, I'm from the United States." She said, "Oh, I used to live in America, but I couldn't stand Earl Browder, and so I moved back to the Soviet Union." Earl Browder was really, 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 really religious. All right, spirituality. Earl Browder was really, really corrupt. And, in 1935, right, the Communist International, they switched their tactic to building a popular front, in which they were going to align with Roosevelt against fascism. The idea was to align with the anti-fascist capitalists. So Earl Browder, that gave Earl Browder the opportunity to take the Communist Party in more of a liberal direction because they're aligning with Roosevelt. And so the Communist Party actually, they started to kind of water down their ideology, and that was the problem. I mean, Earl Browder really wanted to recruit middle-class elements. He really wanted to recruit Hollywood actors and screenwriters. He really wanted to recruit college professors. He really wanted to recruit, kind of intellectuals. Marx's analysis predicted the current... Okay, yeah, that kind of matches another question, but I'll answer that. So he really wanted to recruit, kind of middle class, elements. And so a lot of that was watering down what the Communist Party believed. And they talk about, it was kind of a stereotype in the late 1930s. They'd ask somebody, if you asked a typical member of the Communist Party, what do you guys believe in? They'd say, well, we're really against fascism. We're like a party that really opposes fascism, right? And that in a lot of ways, what it meant to be a communist was kind of watered down, it was kind of, they were seen that way. There's actually a speech that Earl Browder gave, for the anniversary of Lenin's death, and it's kind of like, it's basically, we're the party of Lenin, we're great, and isn't it great that Roosevelt's being accused of being a communist because he's an amazing president, and that shows that being a communist is a good thing. It's kind of, you read a lot of Earl Browder's stuff from the late 30s. A lot of it is very watered down. Some of his earlier stuff is very revolutionary, but you read him in the late 30s when he's in the Popular Front period. He's taking the Popular Front to some rather extreme conclusions, and William Z. Foster and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, they didn't like that. They felt like Earl Browder was kind of watering down communism. Earl Browder, though, when this 1939 pact happened, Roosevelt and the Democratic Party were very angry about the Soviet Union signing the 1939 pact, so they sent Earl Browder to federal prison for a minor passport violation, and they tried to deport his wife, and they launched deportation proceedings against his wife. Earl Browder, despite, whatever, he suffered, okay? And yeah, he went to federal prison for refusing to fight in World War I. He went to federal prison again for a minor passport violation just because the USA wanted to stick it to the Soviet Union because they didn't approve of the pact. As much as I don't agree with Earl Browder, and we're going to get to his real big betrayal later, but let's just be real, okay? Let's give credit where credit is due. There's a lot of people on the internet who talk a lot of shit about a lot of people. They ain't never been to federal prison, I'll tell you that much. So, let's remember that Earl Browder led the Communist Party during its most revolutionary period in the 1930s. He was kind of watering down its ideology, I'll give you that. But he made great sacrifices, and so, he deserves respect in some ways, okay? He got out of federal prison when World War II started, and when World War II started, of course, the Soviet Union and the United States were allies, okay? And so Earl Browder took his crush on the Democrats and his reformism to some pretty extreme conclusions. In 1942, they dissolved the Communist Party. They changed the Communist Party's name to the Communist Political Association. And they said that it was no longer necessary to have a Communist Party. So the Communist Party USA dissolved and became the Communist Political Association. They actually had a petition to cancel the elections. They said that having an election during wartime might hurt the war effort, so they were just hoping that they urged the U.S. government to cancel the elections during the war. They announced that there should be no strikes during the war, and they actually said that there should be no strikes even after the war. And then Earl Browder wrote this book called Tehran, Our Path in War and Peace. That is nuts. And he wrote this book, Tehran, Our Path in War and Peace, basically announcing that class struggle was over, that World War II proved that the USA and the Soviet Union were going to be best pals, best friends forever, and that, the USA hated fascism and so did the Soviets. So eventually the Soviet Union and the USA were going to become one country. They were going to become one country, and they were going to combine the best elements of both systems. The USA, the best elements of capitalism would come to the Soviet Union. The best elements of communism would come to America. Strikes were no longer necessary. Anti-fascism would be the basis of this new order where there's no capitalism and socialism. There's just everyone getting all along, and it was nuts. It was nuts. He denounced Leninism. He said that he was a Marxist Jeffersonian. Not a Marxist-Leninist, and that the Communist Political Association, led by Earl Browder, was pretty nuts. They supported Japanese internment. That's pretty unforgivable, right? I mean, it's one thing to support. I think it was necessary to support. The U.S. government in World War II, but it wasn't necessary to support Japanese internment. You could very easily have spoken up against that, but not Earl Browder. I mean, Earl Browder, he really took U.S. support for, or Soviet alliance with the United States. He took it to ridiculous conclusions. There was a speech he gave over the radio where he read a statement from Mao. Mao was complaining about the fact that weapons were not being given to the Chinese People's Liberation Army. The USA was claiming it was supporting the Chinese people, but it was only giving weapons to Chiang Kai-shek, not giving weapons to the communists in China. So Earl Browder read this statement from Mao on his radio program. And then the State Department called up Earl Browder and said, that's not true. And so then Earl Browder actually got on the radio and apologized for it. I kid you not. He went to visit State Department officials, and they told him, no, you can't say that we're not arming Mao. And so he got on the radio and read this statement. Yes, the U.S. government is arming Mao. And the Chinese Communist Party was furious. They said, this is ridiculous. It's like we're calling out the U.S. imperialists for not supporting us against Japan. And Earl Browder is saying that the U.S. government is telling the truth. So there you go. I mean, that was Earl Browder. Earl Browder was pretty awful. So World War II ends, right? It comes to its conclusion. And a French communist leader named Jacques Duclos, he wrote an article that was circulated all over the world in communist newspapers criticizing Earl Browder and criticizing the way Earl Browder was taking the Communist Party, and denouncing the Communist Political Association, denouncing Leninism, stuff like that, and declaring that the USA was no longer imperialist because it was fighting fascism, that's ridiculous, and stuff like that. So they had an emergency convention of the Communist Party, and they were going to reestablish the Communist Party. They were going to reestablish it. But Earl Browder wouldn't budge, right? The Communist Party, William Z. Foster, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, Claudia Jones, Paul Robeson, Henry Winston, all these leaders of the Communist Party, basically they rose up against Earl Browder. And they weren't even going to expel Earl Browder from the party. They just wanted him to change his position, to just repudiate this idea that U.S. imperialism didn't exist. Earl Browder wouldn't do it. he wouldn't do it. He maintained that there was no such thing as U.S. imperialism, that there was no such thing as class struggle, and so he was expelled from the Communist Party. Thoughts on the 70s era and second wave of radical feminism? Okay, wow, okay. Wow, we're just filling up pages. Lots of super chats tonight. That's okay. All right, 70s radical feminism. All righty. Okay, so yeah, that's Earl Browder. Now, Earl Browder had his own little following for the rest of his life. He actually became the book distributor of the Soviet Union. He had a magazine of his own called Distributor's Guide, and he became kind of a book distributor, and he made quite a bit of money. I understand his family is quite wealthy because of that, and we now know about Bill Browder as this stupid anti-Soviet, anti-Russian activist, and, there's all of that. So, that's... Earl Browder and Foster started out together, but, the power got to Earl Browder's head. He wasn't very revolutionary, and, yeah, he took things in a very negative direction. And I actually have a book that he wrote. He wrote a book in the 1950s during the height of McCarthyism, and it's called Marx and America, and it's actually a very anti-Soviet book. He maintains that the Soviet Union... it's anti-Marxist. He writes Marx in America, and it's a very anti-Soviet book. And he wrote it for, I believe, for Rutgers University. They paid him to write this book. They give a series of lectures on Karl Marx in America. And the whole thing is really, 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 really fascinating. Okay. All righty. All right. So that's that super chat. U.S. capitalism already collapsing before COVID-19. Yeah, U.S. capitalism was already in a state of decline before the COVID-19 crisis, mainly due to the fact of the computer revolution, right? Capitalism, you have the business owners, the factory owners constantly trying to eliminate workers from the means of production, hire as few workers as possible, replace workers with machines, make the workers that are there already, make them easily replaceable, de-skill the jobs, everything you can to eliminate workers from production, to, drive down the wages of workers. This is all Marx laid out, all of this in Capital, in Poverty of Philosophy. This is the natural process of capitalism, right? Is when you just, you're trying to maximize profits, so you try to produce as much for as cheap as you can. And the computer revolution has enabled the capitalists to do that, to produce far more than ever before without, with less and less workers. That leads to a falling rate of profit. No Dugan questions, not going to do it. Leads to a falling rate of profit. And, and as a result of that, the capitalists soon have markets that are glutted with products that cannot be sold. Workers are also consumers. If you eliminate people from the means of production, if you lower people's wages, they can't buy back the products that they produce. And the low standard of living of the millennial generation compared to their parents, the lack of good-paying manufacturing jobs, the global apparatus of production where single products are produced in all kinds of different countries, all of this leads to a crisis of capitalism. And when Trump took office, he immediately lifted a bunch of regulations and artificially stimulated the economy in some ways. But it all ultimately leads to a lower standard of living. And the standard of living of average Americans has been decreasing since the 1980s. There's been a continuing decline in the U.S. standard of living. And as a result of that, people aren't buying back the products. And the first, big explosion we saw of this, the first major explosion was the 2008, 2009 financial crisis. But this COVID-19 slowdown is a result of these same problems. We were heading for a slowdown anyway. Long before people were talking about pandemics, there was already problems on the stock market. And this is the natural cycle of capitalism in crisis. What is class reductionism? Well, it's funny. This has turned into like a buzz phrase among the synthetic left now. If you're one of the people that they don't like, and if you're like on their shit list, you're a Nazbol, a Red Brown, a Strasserist, Stalinist, Tanky, and now latest, you're a class reductionist. So class reductionism is actually a real thing. Unlike most of those words I just said, that's actually like a real thing. Class reductionism is basically, you know, communists, for example, fight against national oppression, right? You know, if there's a capitalist country that is being super exploited by the imperialists, you would support the whole nation fighting for its independence. Black people in the United States fight against racism. Well, I mean, class reductionism would be if you were to say, well, I only support black workers against racism. If there's racism against a black business owner, racism against a black millionaire, I'm in favor of that. That's class reductionism. Class reductionism is when you ignore everything but the class struggle. That's what class reductionism. You reduce everything to class. You ignore everything but the class struggle. That's what class reductionism is. There's a certain communist group, I'm not going to name names, that will actually chant at their rallies, white power and black power are the same. Racism is the boss's game. Well, that's class reductionism. And white power and black power are not the same. They're not, right? So class reductionism is when you're basically saying, gender oppression doesn't exist, racism doesn't exist, national oppression doesn't exist, imperialism doesn't exist. It's just workers and bosses. That's class reductionism. And yes, there are people who do that. Some people talk about economism. That's one definition that people have used of economism. Yeah, that's all there is to that. That's what class reductionism actually means. Basically, if you talk about the class struggle, they turn everything into something it's not. But yeah, I mean, actual class reductionism, where if you were to deny that racism exists, or you were to say, like, you wouldn't defend a billionaire against racism, or if you were to, deny that the oppression of women exists, or deny that imperialism exists, if everything's just about workers and bosses, that's class reductionism. And that's not good. That's not what these people, now it's been turned into this slur. It means you don't agree with them, right? They support U.S. foreign policy. They do, you know that. And you know who the they is I'm talking about. They support U.S. foreign policy. They support not fighting for economic demands. They support Joe Biden. They think that Trump is a fascist, and so therefore we should, unite with the liberal order against Trump and just become foot soldiers of the liberal order against Trump, and that's what they think. And, and if you don't go along with what they think, you're a class reductionist. Again, they don't even know what this word means, right? They don't even know half this crap, right? I mean, you listen to them talk, they don't even know anything. I mean, they don't. I mean, they don't understand Marxism. They don't know the history of Marxism. They don't care. That's not their job, right? And, you know who they are, and they support U.S. foreign policy, and they also basically want to silence any real leftism, and they really oppose populism. So that's who they are. And so, they're using class reductionism, but it's a real thing. Actual class reductionism is a problem. But what these people, have changed it to, it's not what it is. Okay. Would it be possible to pressure Biden from the left? Sure. It's also possible to pressure Trump from the left. I mean, it depends on the dynamics of the forces at the time. This is often an argument that people make for the Democrats. Well, it's easier to pressure the Democrats from the left. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. It just depends on the situation. If the Democrats are under extreme threat, they may be forced to give more concessions to the left out of self-protection. And I think that's happening right now. I think they're letting, the mainstream media is allowing the left to do a lot of things they wouldn't normally allow. They're letting people talk about socialism more than they used to. They're encouraging protests a lot more than they used to. I mean, it used to be whenever there was a protest, they portrayed them as like criminals and, they're all insane and stuff. Well, now, CNN has been very sympathetic to a lot of the protests that's going on. And that's because there's a fight in the ruling class and Trump and all of that, right? So yeah, on the one hand, like right now, the Democrats, because they're fighting Trump, are being a lot more tolerant of things on the left they wouldn't normally tolerate. That said, though, let's not forget that, if Trump were to be defeated and Trump were no longer a threat, it's not necessarily true that they would still, obviously Trump's movement would still be there. It's complicated. Not necessarily. You can't assume that just because a Democrat's in office, it'll be easier to pressure them from the left. You can't assume that. It could be true. And Roosevelt, because he was a Democrat, because he was facing a fascist opposition, was easy to pressure from the left. Bill Clinton, on the other hand, Bill Clinton was not easy to pressure from the left. And in fact, Bill Clinton did a lot of things that Republicans would never have gotten away with. If Reagan had done anything near what Bill Clinton did with the welfare stuff, if Reagan had done that, there would have been a mass protest and uprising against Reagan. But Clinton did it, so he got away with it. Bill Clinton and his foreign interventions that he carried out. A lot of what Bill Clinton did, he got away with because he was a Democrat. And the same with Obama. Obama got away with a lot of things. Great example, right? Earlier in this live at the beginning, we talked about Trump grabbing people, the feds on the streets of Portland right now, right? And how the federal agents on the streets of Portland are grabbing people, detaining them, and basically the federal officers are on the streets of Oregon, engaging in repression. And that's on the front page of the Washington Post, and it's on the front page of the New York Times. If Biden were in office, I doubt it would be. Democrats are fantastic at counter-scheduling. I don't know what that means. But if, for example, if Biden were in office and there were protests going on in Portland and the military were sent in to put him down and they were detaining people and stuff, I bet you the Washington Post and the New York Times wouldn't cover it. I bet you they would just pretend it didn't happen. And if I remember when, Obama's Department of Justice raided the homes of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, right? They raided the homes of this socialist activist group, and mainstream media looked the other way and pretended it didn't happen, right? And it was like, I called into the Alan Colmes show, right? Because it was a show you could call in on Fox News Radio at the time. And I called in, and Alan Colmes' producer said, that story is bullshit. And I said, how is it bullshit? I mean, it's true. I mean, Obama. But imagine if Trump were to send the FBI to raid the home of some socialists, it would be in the New York Times, right? So it's complicated. It's complicated. That's all I'm saying. I don't know who's better, right? In some ways, Biden is definitely worse than Trump on foreign policy. But in many ways, Trump is definitely worse than Biden on domestic policy. I think Biden would probably be handling COVID-19 a lot better. I think he would have the situation around COVID-19. He'd have things stabilized much more than Trump has. But in terms of international policy, Biden could very well lead to World War III a lot quicker than Trump could. So, but there's other ways that they're different. There's other differences, right? I mean, I don't know who's better. And I don't endorse any candidate. So even if I did have a preference, of Trump or Biden, I wouldn't tell it to you because that would bias my reporting, and I don't play that way. But I don't know who's better, honestly. There are some things about Trump that are reprehensible. There are some things about Biden that are reprehensible, right? Trump has never gotten us into a war. He's taken us pretty damn close, right? And he attacked the Syrian Arab Republic, which, he did the first direct attack on the Syrian Arab Republic. He killed Qasem Soleimani. He's tried some CIA stuff in Venezuela. But, to be fair, Obama got us into a new war in Libya. Well, Trump has not gotten us into a new war yet. Obama got us into a new war in Syria. Trump's not gotten us into a new war yet. Joe Biden voted for the Iraq war. That's one thing I don't understand about these people. It's like they want to make it a scandal if you talk to somebody right-wing, right? If you shook hands with somebody right-wing, if you sat next to somebody right-wing, it's a scandal. But these shills will get on there and tell you must vote for Joe Biden, right? So they're not sitting with Joe Biden. They're not talking to Joe Biden. They're campaigning for Joe Biden. Joe Biden is responsible for the deaths of millions of people. He was a supporter of the U.S. invasion of Iraq. He lied to the American people, said Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. We have to invade Iraq or else they're going to nuke us, right? We're all going to die. Bannon and Trump want to break up China. All right. And no one says, oh, wow, you're campaigning for a murderous war criminal. No one ever says that. No one ever says that. No one ever says, oh, well, they're campaigning. It's like campaigning for murderous Democrats. That's normal. But sitting next to some right-winger, oh, can't do that. That shows how ridiculous these people are. Okay, so protests in Syria and Bulgaria. I haven't followed it enough to say something accurate. I don't want to say anything inaccurate, so I have some ideas, but I don't want to say anything until I'm sure of what I'm saying. Azerbaijan-Armenia conflict, again, not a situation I followed closely enough to really fully comment on it. All right, imperialist fights over the Middle East. Well, it's interesting because I think, the questioner was asking about, are the imperialists trying to divide the Middle East? The Sykes-Picot Agreement. The modern Middle East was created by the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which was a secret treaty between the United States, Russia, Britain, and France, drawn up during World War I, that divided up the Middle East among the imperialist powers. And that's where you get Iraq, that's where you get Syria, that's where you get Saudi Arabia. That's where the borders of the Middle East were drawn. It was the imperialists kind of carved it up for themselves. Are there divisions? I mean, France was very, very opposed to the U.S. military intervention in Iraq. They were friendly to the Iraqi government, and they helped Iraq get nuclear power. They had oil deals, they were friendlier to Iraq. However, France is very, very supportive of U.S. intervention in Syria. France, as the former colonizer of Syria, was hugely supportive of the USA arming terrorists and trying to tear down the Syrian Arab Republic. So it's complicated. Italy was a big supporter of U.S. military intervention in Libya. So it's complicated. I think that, the various European imperialist powers would like to get a chunk of the Middle East. I mean, let's remember the Germans were big supporters of U.S. military intervention in Serbia. German capital was hugely supportive of the NATO intervention and bombing of Serbia. So it's complicated. But yeah, I mean, are they going to try and carve it up for themselves? Yeah, but at the end of the day, it's Britain and the United States that sit at the head of the imperialist camp. There's not a real solid, opposition to them within the imperialist bloc yet. I mean, there's like I hinted earlier, Germany is starting to have some level of independence, but overall, for the most part, the Western capitalist powers ride together, and Britain and the United States are the top dogs. There you go. It's about them dominating the world. Latest from Yemen. Yeah, the war is continuing. The bombing is continuing. The Yemeni people are being killed, even amid a pandemic. They continue to commit war crimes. There is a division among the pro-Saudi forces, as I've mentioned before. There's Mansour Hadi's coalition. There's another coalition of anti-Houthi forces, like the southern forces. So there's like two governments that are anti-Houthi. It's complicated, but ultimately, yeah, this is Yemen fighting for its independence and national liberation against Western capitalism and imperialism. The Saudis are backing Mansour Hadi. The United Arab Emirates and some of the European imperialist powers are backing a more moderate government that has been set up, but they're both trying to stop the Revolutionary Council. The Revolutionary Committee that headed by the Southern Movement, which is the group that wants to restore the Democratic People's Republic of Yemen, by the Houthi Ansar Allah group. And there are different factions that are supporting the Houthis or that are aligned with the Houthis. So that's the situation there. Okay. All right. Chinese land acquisition in Africa and racial tension. Well, there's going to be tension, right? Now, China, the first time China ever started really heavily intervening in Africa was in the 1970s when they were supporting the government of Julius Nyerere, who was the socialist leader of Tanzania. Julius Nyerere was the socialist leader of Tanzania, and China worked closely with him. This was during the Mao era, during the Gang of Four era, and they built railroads. And you can read about how China went out of its way to make sure that the foreign workers who were sent to China didn't have a higher living standard than the local Tanzanian population. It was very, very much solidarity aid, and they built this railroad in Tanzania, and that was China's first foreign infrastructure project. It was back in the 70s. But yeah, now there's, especially because of the fact that rare earth metals are very, very important in the global economy, China is very, very heavily invested in Africa. And rare earth minerals are the future, right? That's computer chips, that's electric car batteries. Rare earth minerals are the future. Oil is the past. The USA controls the oil. The USA and Britain control the oil. But at the same time, let's remember that, China has basically got the rare earth minerals and metals market controlled, So, Africa is very key. There's a lot of rare earth minerals and such in Africa, and that's very important. And, China is heavily invested. And there are, there's stories from Kenya I've seen. There's examples of Chinese corporations doing bad things in Africa. And that's not cool. And that should be opposed, right? You should always oppose that. I don't support any violation of any workers' rights. I don't support any racial discrimination. Never should that be tolerated. But at the same time, the role that China is playing in Africa economically is a progressive one. They're building infrastructure. They're raising countries out of poverty. The role that American banks and corporations and oil companies are playing in Africa is a negative one. They're keeping the countries poor and beating them down as captive markets, right? Compare Angola, an oil-rich country that has been trading, with China. Compare, what's been going on in Angola since like 2002 with what's been going on in Nigeria for the past 60 years. Nigeria, if Western capitalism and foreign investment and free markets were the road to prosperity, Nigeria would be hugely prosperous because Shell Oil and ExxonMobil and BP have been in there for so long, sucking the oil out of the ground, and Nigeria is poorer than ever, mass unemployment, mass malnutrition, lack of education, child labor, low life expectancy, high infant mortality rate. Nigeria is a case study in what happens when Western capitalism controls your country. Angola, however, in 2002, their civil war finally came to an end. China was in there, and what they achieved in just since 2002 has been amazing. Huge amounts of economic growth. Some of the highest GDP growth rates in the world. It's amazing, right? You can compare. Right? You can make comparisons. So, yeah, are Chinese corporations doing bad things in Africa? Sometimes, yeah, and that's not okay. And I hope that the Chinese state will crack down and make sure that doesn't happen, because that hurts China in the long run. But at the same time, China's role in Africa is a very different one. China wants Africa to be richer so that China has more of an economy to trade with. Wall Street and London want Africa to be poorer so they can maintain their dominance on the global markets. Conflict in the Balkans. Yeah, I don't really know enough about that. Okay, crypto-fascist. What is a crypto-fascist? Well, good question. Good question. Now, crypto tends to refer to secretly, right? So if you are actually something, you're a crypto that, right? If someone is a member of the Democratic Party, but they vote like Republicans, they're supported by Republicans. Stokely Carmichael, sure, yeah. We'll talk about that. They're supported by Republicans, they have Republican positions. At that point, they might be a crypto Republican, right? They claim to be a Democrat, but they're a crypto Republican. At one point, the allegation, I think communist groups were accusing each other of being crypto Trotskyists. Well, you say you're a Maoist, you say you're a Stalinist, you're against Trotsky, but your policies are kind of Trotskyist, you're a crypto Trotskyist. So I assume that crypto fascist would allege that someone is saying they're one thing and they're actually a fascist. I would assume that that's what that means, but I don't know. It's one of these stupid words that stupid people make up, and I don't know. So there you go. I think it would refer to crypto, like someone who's something else, saying they're something else, but they're secretly a fascist. I think that's what that term probably means. All right. Now, this person asked about Russia being socialist post-Putin. Well, it's more complicated than that. It's very much more complicated than that, right? In the 1990s, Russia was extremely free market, and Boris Yeltsin, and the country was looted. Putin, Russia moved in a more socialistic direction under Putin by, him centering the economy around Gazprom and Rosneft, two state-controlled megacorporations. There's a huge amount of state control in the Russian economy. A lot of the mining is run by the state. And a lot of the private companies in Russia are private, but they're not really market institutions. Like, they do what the state says. They're subsidized by the state. The Communist Party is a big part of the Russian government. It has a lot of representatives, and, it's not the ruling party anymore. But it's more complicated than that. Russia is it's already got a huge amount of state central planning going on. Marxism is not the ideology in Russia anymore by any means. They don't believe in Marxism. They don't espouse Marxism. They're Russian Orthodox. They are nationalistic. They are definitely not a left-wing country in their view. They're very conservative and traditional in their view. But there are Marxists in the government that have seats and such. Marxism has a huge influence on the whole country. How could it not? Right? I covered the elections there a couple years back, and I met with leaders of the Communist Party. So yeah, okay. All right, Scooby-Doo, synthetic left. I don't know. I remember, when I was a kid, my parents, they wouldn't let me watch television that had commercials on it. They were like really kind of controlling. They would only, when I was like a little child, they would only let me watch PBS. And so I would go to my babysitter's house sometimes, and my babysitter would let me watch Scooby-Doo. And so I became familiar with that weird cartoon from the 70s with a dog and that guy with a shag haircut, and they drive a van, and they eat Scooby snacks, and there's a guy who dresses up in a costume. They always think there's a monster, but it's actually a guy dressed up in a costume. And it gets to be a little bit boring after a while. I remember thinking, like, every episode is the same. It's a guy dressed up in a costume. It's not really a monster, so why, I don't know. Is it synthetic left? I don't know. Is there politics there? I don't know. I never saw it as political. It's kind of 70s hippie counterculture. Finnish Bolshevik. It's kind of 70s hippie counterculture, I guess, right? They're driving a van. Some people say that when they're eating the Scooby snacks, it's because they have the munchies or something. But I don't know. I never really, I don't see it as that political. They're kind of hippies. They're kind of like 70s cool, but there's not really any politics in that show that I can tell. It's a fun question, though. Thanks for asking. Okay. Alrighty. Is the American empire like Rome? Well, yes. And actually, if you want a more in-depth answer to that question, you should watch the lecture that I gave. Is America the new Rome? Will it fall? I gave a 60-minute presentation on that very question. And yes, there are many parallels between the United States and the fall of the Roman Empire. Rome, was a slave economy, and feudalism had emerged, and Rome was basically going around the world holding back development, beating down countries that had feudalism, which was a higher mode of production than slavery, and their economic base became less and less efficient the longer they maintained it. They made up the difference by plundering people from around the world. They played a reactionary role in the history of the world, basically. The Roman Empire was trying to hold back the wheels of history. The world was moving toward feudalism, and they were trying to maintain a slave empire. Watch my lecture. I don't want to ruin it here and give you not as good. I gave a very good presentation on this question, and I address it in the book City Builders and Vandals as well. I think the fall of the Roman Empire is worth studying if you want to understand the period we're in. I think the United States and the fall of Rome, there are some key parallels. But I also think there was a moment where Rome had the opportunity to start moving in the opposite direction. And that was with the administration and leadership of Julius Caesar. And Michael Parenti wrote a very good book about that, and how Rome could have started moving in the opposite direction, except Julius Caesar was assassinated. So, I talked about that in City Builders and Vandals and in my presentation as well. And that class I gave on the fall of the Roman Empire is very popular because there's actually, I'm sorry, my allergies are just driving me nuts here. There's actually a clip from it, Socialists Are Not Snowflakes, which people like, where towards the end I gave kind of a fiery conclusion to that lecture. So watch my talk, Is America the New Rome? Will it fall? That's what I recommend. All right, Bukharin and Deng Xiaoping. Okay, so for those of you who don't know, at the time of of Lenin's death, there were three factions in the Soviet Communist Party. There was Trotsky's faction that believed in permanent revolution. They wanted the Soviet Union to be just a temporary holdout in a global revolutionary struggle. There was Stalin's faction that believed in socialism in one country, and the idea was they were going to have 5-year plans and build up the economy. And then there was Bukharin's faction, and Bukharin's faction was basically, wanting to maintain the new economic policy, keep kind of a private economy, but sign treaties with the West. And that was That was the difference. And I can see some similarities. Deng Xiaoping, the leader who came after Mao, he was aligned with Western countries. I mean, very close to Jimmy Carter in the United States. And he was more for a free market approach. So there's some similarities. I think the difference is that Bukharin wanted the Soviet Union to have the policies before it had industrialized. Whereas Mao had already brought some industry to the Soviet Union. He'd built steel industries and power plants and such in China. And Deng Xiaoping then wanted market reforms on the basis of already having a few decades of socialist construction. That's the difference. Bukharin was for maintaining the new economic policy before socialist construction. Deng Xiaoping was on the basis of Mao's socialist construction, then having reform and opening up. There's a difference there. But it's similar, right? Okay. I have not seen the movie Death of Stalin. I haven't seen it. I didn't really want to see it. But one thing that I noticed about it, it kind of reminded me, there's this very famous Russian comedy, The Inspector General. It was like a very famous Russian play, a kind of a comedy play about, there's this man who's going from town to town, and he goes to a small village, and the people in the village are convinced he's like a secret inspector from the government who's gonna like report all their misdeeds, and so they start kissing his ass, thinking he's the Inspector General. He's not, and it's supposed to be this kind of like comedy about Russian bureaucrats from the Tsarist era. It's a classic work of literature, right? 1800s, I think it was written. It was performed all over the world. I mean, it was just a very well-loved comedy about bureaucracy and bureaucrats. And I get the idea that when I saw some of the reviews of Death of Stalin, it was an attempt to write a comedy about the death of the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin in the style of The Inspector General, the classic Russian comedy play. I just didn't have an interest in seeing that. And with Stalin, every rumor, there's all these quotes, for example, attributed to Stalin, right? Like, and it's like, it's not things that actually come from Stalin's speeches. It's stuff that like Winston Churchill heard him say or something, right? Like, people say that, the death of one is a tragedy. The death of millions is just a statistic. Stalin allegedly said that, according to Winston Churchill. But it's like, it's not a real quote. It's something Winston Churchill says he said, right? It's not something from his official works. It's not something he ever said in a speech. It's something Winston Churchill says he said. But you'll see it as undisputed fact. Stalin said this. And there's a lot of that. There's Stalin's housekeeper, or somebody who claims to have been Stalin's housekeeper says that he did some awful thing, and it gets published, and it's just fact. And I don't like that. And I have a feeling that a movie like that is going to be full of, rumors and allegations and unproven claims, and it's just going to feed into this narrative, this is the party line in the United States now. Stalin was worse than Hitler. Well, Stalin, saved the world from fascism. Stalin industrialized the Soviet Union and raised millions out of poverty. Stalin did a lot to improve a lot of people's lives, including people in the United States. I mean, there would be no civil rights movement, if it weren't for Stalin. If it wasn't for the Soviet Union and the Communist Party and the huge efforts they made, to highlight the issue of civil rights, they never would have allowed someone like Martin Luther King to become as powerful as he was. So, to say things like Stalin is worse than Hitler, or Stalin's the equivalent of Hitler, that's so historically absurd. But that's the party line in America right now, that's the way these things work. So it's just, I didn't have an interest in seeing it. All right, Tony Cliff. All right, so earlier we were talking about Max Shachtman. All right, so there's Trotsky. 1939 comes along. Trotsky says the Soviet Union is a deformed workers' state. Max Shachtman says it's bureaucratic collectivism, state capitalism. I have no idea who that Chinese historian and philosopher is, Brave New Perth, so I can't answer your question. Thanks for asking. Comes along. So Max Shachtman comes along. He says it's bureaucratic collectivism. Eventually, though, Max Shachtman denounces Leninism, right? In the 1960s, in the early 60s, Max Shachtman says, you know what? Leninism is no good, right? We're just going to join the Socialist Party. So his group dissolves. They join the Socialist Party. Well, in Berkeley, California, the Independent Socialist Club, which were the Shachtman group of Berkeley, they held on to Leninism, so they started following a British Trotskyist named Tony Cliff. Tony Cliff was a prominent British Trotskyist who was a third camp Trotskyist, right? He was just a very prominent British Trotskyist who was third camp, right? So Trotskyism divides into three, right? First, you have what you call mainline Trotskyists. They are very active in the labor movement. They kind of support Cuba. They kind of support Vietnam. They kind of support China, but they are deformed worker states. They don't really support them, but they kind of like, okay, they'll like admit that they have socialistic aspects. They'll admit they're not capitalist, but they usually side with America against them. But they kind of support socialist countries, and they're into labor unions. That's like mainline Trotskyism. That's socialist alternative. The US SWP used to be like that. Socialist Action, groups like that. They're what you call mainline Trotskyists. Then you have what you call orthodox Trotskyists, and those are insane Trotskyists that, they're like the Spartacist League, the Posadaists that are into UFOs, and they're wildly sectarian Trotskyists who like say things that, that maintain Trotsky was assassinated by other Trotskyists and stuff like that. And yeah, there's like ortho-trots, they're nuts. There's mainline trots that are whatever, they're leftists, they're anti-communist, but they're kind of whatever. And they protest against the Vietnam War. They did that. They do a lot of anti-war activism. They promote labor unions. They're kind of anti-imperialist, but not really. They're a little bit confused. And then there's this other category of what you call third camp Trotskyists. And those are the ones that maintain the Soviet Union and Cuba and every socialist country ever was state capitalism and had nothing to do with socialism. And they're not in support of any anti-imperialist or socialist country. They're for this magical third camp, right? That's what makes them different. They would never support an anti-imperialist country. The anti-imperialist countries and the Western capitalist countries are just the same, and they're for this magical third camp that doesn't exist, right? They're class reductionists in a way, right? Because they don't recognize that there are countries struggling against imperialism and such. They're for this third camp, and they're really a faction of what you can call the new left. And Max Shachtman was kind of the father of third camp Trotskyism. Some people call it neo-Trotskyism. But in addition to that, you have Tony Cliff, Tony Cliff was the prominent neo-Trotskyist of the United Kingdom, right? In the United Kingdom, Ted Grant and Alan Woods were like the fathers of mainline Trotskyism. Jerry Healy was like the ortho-trot, and Tony Cliff was the third camp Trotskyist. And that's Tony Cliff, right? The Soviet Union was state capitalism, wasn't real socialism. No, real socialism has never existed. It's just this, fantasy land or whatever. Yeah, that's Tony Cliff. And ISO, the International Socialist Organization, they were followers of Shachtman, who when Shachtman denounced Leninism and dissolved his organization, they became followers of Tony Cliff. The International Socialist Tendency, the IST, that's the Cliffite tendency. That's international socialists, International Socialist Tendency. That's them. And a lot of them, in the USA, the ISO, the International Socialist Organization, was the main Cliffite group, but they dissolved into the DSA. They no longer exist. So they dissolved into the Democratic Socialists of America now. But there's still Cliffites in the USA. It's, International Socialists, whatever. It's, yeah. They're weird. Like a lot of the Cliffite groups actually are very critical of Israel. There's a Cliffite group that's pro-Israel in the United Kingdom. It's called Alliance for Workers' Liberty, and they're pro-Israel, and they attack the other Cliffite groups for being anti-Semitic, and it's a whole mess. It's a whole mess. How do I reconcile spirituality and communism? Well, let's be honest, okay? I'm getting into this a little bit in the new book because I can't not touch on it, even though my book is about distortion of leftism and such. The 20th century happened. The 20th century happened. Amazing things happened in the 20th century due to socialism. Russia and China became industrial superpowers and raised millions out of poverty. All kinds of countries in the developing world broke out of imperialism and started industrializing on their own and redistributing land, and huge things were achieved in the 20th century by Marxism, Leninism in power. And I uphold all of those things, and I study all of those things. And I have studied Marxism, Leninism, and I probably, of all the anti-imperialist ideologies out there, I draw the most from Marxism, Leninism. And I used to have the complete works of Lenin, and and I would read like different volumes of it every day, and on my way to work, and I, in a lot of ways, my views are very ML, but here's the but, okay? Like, the Soviet Union fell. China really had to adjust their system away from the Soviet-style system in order to survive. And socialism has come into the world in other places now. Venezuela, Bolivia, Nicaragua. They started moving towards socialism, but they are not Marxist-Leninists. They're definitely Marxist-influenced, but they're Bolivarian socialists, and they have a different perspective, right? And they're, Evo Morales and Hugo Chavez were both Roman Catholic, right? Now, Evo Morales also practiced indigenous religion. In Nicaragua, Roman Catholic teaching is very, very central, but they also practice, indigenous faith there a lot. The slogan of the Nicaraguan government is Christianity, Socialism, and Solidarity. Libya, they constructed socialism. In Libya from 1969 to 2011, they were building a socialist society. And then they believed in Islamic socialism, and they were heavily influenced by Islam. The Ba'ath countries, Iraq and Syria, they had socialism there, and they were heavily influenced by Marxism, but they had a Ba'ath Arab socialist ideology. Iran has broken out of Western capitalism and imperialism, but they're not Marxists, and they don't even identify as socialists. They call their system not capitalism, but Islam, right? And the state controls the major industries, and they have plans, and they have revolutionary committees in neighborhoods called Basij, but they're not from the Marxist tradition. And that this belief that only the Marxist tradition can create socialism is very naive, number one. And number two, if all it took to get out of the crisis was to apply Marxism 100% correctly, I believe the 21st century would look very, very different right now, right? This idea that all the answers to our crisis come from just applying the magical theory of Marxism-Leninism correctly. Right? If we just study Marx and Lenin hard enough and do exactly as they said well enough, then we'll have, world communism. I don't think it works that way. Right? And let me add that we've also learned in the 20th century that a lot of what makes people great revolutionary fighters is not their economic conditions. A lot of what motivates people to sacrifice and give everything they have for revolution is not their direct economic interests. And on that basis, I maintain, personally, that I think that the dialectical philosophy, dialectical materialism, is largely correct, but it doesn't have the answer to absolutely everything. And I would maintain that, yes, I think that there is a spiritual side to mankind, that human beings are not just another animal that happens to have consciousness. I would maintain that there is a God in the universe, and my views are not strictly dialectical materialist and pure Marxist at this point. Now, I uphold all existing socialism, and I identify most closely with Marxism-Leninism, but I'm open to Baathism, I'm open to Bolivarianism, I'm open to Islamic socialism, I'm open to all kinds of anti-imperialist ideologies, and I think we should study all of them, but blindly adhere to none of them. And we need to study all different anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist ideologies and construct one that will get us out of the crisis that we're in. Everywhere socialism has ever been applied, it has been applied uniquely to the unique conditions. So in that sense, I don't think that the anti-clerical, anti-spiritual side of Marxism is necessarily going to work. And honestly, I think that the anti-clerical and anti-spiritual side of Marxism is rooted in the period in which Marxism originated. You have to remember, I'm not going to talk about traditionalists, okay? Traditionalists. All right, I'll give you like a brief answer to that later. All right, but anyway, what was I saying? So, the anti-clerical, anti-spiritual side of Marxism was largely due to the fact that Marxism originated in Europe, as Europe was struggling to overthrow feudalism. right? The French Revolution was an uprising against the Catholic feudal state of France. All over Europe, people were rising up against feudalism, which was enforced with, theocracy, basically. I mean, and so, it was the dawn of reason and science and the Enlightenment. And in the name of that, Marxism very much is stamped by the soil that it grew up in, which is the soil of the age of reason, the Enlightenment, and the revolution in Europe to tear down feudalism. That's Marxism's origins. But that period, the thinking of that period, number one, is, quite violent, right? It's quite based on the assumption that confrontation is always the answer, right? The periods, the 1800s in Europe, 1848 in particular, but 1800 to like the 1870s in Europe, huge amounts of bloodshed and killing, lots of violence. Confrontation is the answer, right? William Blake, I shall not, I shall not sleep from mental strife, nor shall my sword sleep in my hand until we have built Jerusalem and England's green and pleasant land, right? We're going to just keep killing and keep slaying and murdering until we create utopia and heaven on earth, the reign of terror after the French Revolution. This idea that confrontation and, is the answer to everything, and that religion is just stupid superstition. It's something invented by the feudal hierarchy to control people. We want to tear down all religious belief. Reason and science is the answer, right? That was the feeling of the time. That was 1848 when the Communist Manifesto was written. That's how people felt. We don't live in that time anymore. No one is forcing you in the United States to be religious. No one is forcing you in the United States to do that. Plus, we've had the 20th century behind us, a lot of war, a lot of killing, and it's complicated, right? And that Marxism as an ideology started in a place where it was very much stamped by the period in which it grew. And my feeling is that as Marxism moved out of Europe, it became less like Europe. For example, the party of a new type, which is a concept that Lenin developed, the vanguard party. On paper, it's purely a Marxist concept. However, if you look at Russia's history, it very much fits Russian history, right? In Russia, you have the old believers. You have the, the Decembrists, right? And there's a whole history of like secret societies and revolutionary conspiracies in Russia, people who give the whole of their lives to a political ideal. That's very Russian, right? There's a whole history of Eurasian, collectivist, traditionalism. There's a traditionalist edge. There's a kind of weird Russian conservative edge to Leninism, right? Let's just be real about it. There is. Right? Furthermore, as communism goes to China, before Mao was born, there was a huge peasant uprising in China called the Taiping Uprising. And this guy, who believed he was Jesus' younger brother, showed up in China and organized millions of peasants to kill their landlords and redistribute land, and to build the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom or whatever. And it was this huge uprising of Chinese peasants. And it went on. And millions of people died. And it was a civil war. That happened. And, what Mao did, yes, Mao was a Marxist. Mao drew from Marxism. But he also drew from China's unique conditions and the Taiping Uprising and all of that. And that, as Marxism left Europe, it became less and less like that revolutionary intelligentsia. So, there you go. And that revolutionary intelligentsia that developed that purely materialist philosophy, that purely dialectical philosophy, right? There is no spirituality, number one. It's only material, number one. Number two, all change comes through violence and confrontation. That's the dialectical view. That view, that was very much the French Revolution. That was the German Revolution of 1848. That was the triumph of reason and science. But history has moved on a little bit. The Chinese Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Middle Eastern revolutions that have gone on, the revolutions in Latin America show that ideology is correct in many ways, but it's not 100% correct. And that there were aspects of the Chinese Revolution that were not dialectical and materialist, that were spiritual. There were aspects of the Russian Revolution that were not dialectical and materialist, that were spiritual. And that it's more complicated than that. So that's how I reconcile spirituality and communism. And you don't have to agree with me. So that's that. How did Marx's analysis predict the current state? Well, I mean, as I answered before, right? The basic understanding of Marx is that capitalism is a system where production is carried out for profit. Production is carried out for profit, and that leads to capitalists trying to churn out as many goods as they possibly can, and that leads to capitalists eliminating workers from the means of production. And as you eliminate workers from the assembly line, there's a falling rate of profit. And on top of that, the workers are also the consumers, and they can't buy back the product that they produce, and this leads to an economic crisis. That is basic Marxist economics, 101. That's basic Marxist economics. That's what that is. And as much as Marx was wrong about the role that Europe would play in the world, Marx very much believed that capitalism was the most advanced, so it was going to spread, it was going to spread to Europe, right? It was going to spread around the developing world. Well, Lenin showed that Marx was wrong about that. Marx was wrong about a lot of questions. But his basic economic analysis of the problems of production organized for profit has been proven very, very correct. And many capitalist economists will admit that, right? That the boom-bust cycle and his understanding of why it's caused, what causes the problems of capitalist production, it's all very, very correct, right? And that the worker and the capitalist have contrary interests, and that the capitalist inevitably, leads to a crisis, and that the anarchy of production leads to instability and holds back human progress. That's very true. And that's the current situation that we're in. We've gotten too good at mass production. We've gotten too good at making things. As a result, millions are poor. We stand outcast and starving mid the wonders we have made. That's the situation of our modern world. We have gotten too good at making stuff. But as a result, there's poverty. Capitalism is a system where people are homeless because there are too many houses, where people are hungry because there is too much food. It is deeply irrational. People are cold in the winter because there is too much heating gas. This is not a rational system, and it calls for the banks, factories, and industries, and the major centers of economic power, to be organized to serve public good, production upon a predetermined plan, society taking control of the means of production. That is what Marx predicted, and Marx is very, very correct about all of that. And his economic understanding of how human history develops, how new modes of production come into existence, the problems of the capitalist mode of production that will eventually lead to socialism, they're all pretty much correct. China's surging ahead right now because they have the socialist mode of production. The economy doesn't function simply on the basis of profit. The state controls the means of production and forces them to work in the interests of society, and so they can have uninterrupted economic growth. Meanwhile, the United States, we have production for profit, and there's chaos, and things are getting worse. So I think, in a lot of ways, Marx's analysis has proved to be very, 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 very correct. Alrighty. 1970s radical feminism. Well, battered women's shelters were set up in the 1970s, right? It used to be domestic violence was something that wasn't taken seriously. People thought, at one point, believe it or not, people thought men beating up women was just normal and okay. Well, in the 1970s, radical feminists came along and said, no, that's not okay. And they built battered women's shelters, and they changed the way society viewed domestic violence. Good for them, right? They worked hard to make sure that contraception and abortion were available. Good for them. The right of women that are LGBT, to be gay and, be lesbian, or, they fought for that, A lot of good things that 1970s radical feminists did. The people talk about second wave feminism. That was the second wave. I'm a feminist in the sense that I believe in the equality of the sexes. I almost said I'm not a feminist, but no, I'm a feminist in one sense of the word. I'm not an ideological feminist. But I mean, I'm a feminist in the sense that I oppose the oppression of women and I believe in the equality of the sexes. I'm not an ideological feminist. I'm more of a Marxist, but I mean, 1970s, in feminism, they talk about the first wave being the fight for women's right to vote. The second wave being, what they call radical feminism in the 70s, women, working outside the home, abortion, such. And now we have third wave feminism, which is about intersectionality and all of that. So that's kind of what that is all about. What's interesting is that Gloria Steinem, who is kind of the, who is like, she was the second wave feminist in the United States. She was like the voice of American feminism. She was a CIA agent. That's a fact. And look at her Wikipedia page. Okay, there's somebody. I swear, as soon as I said Gloria Steinem was a CIA agent, someone's gonna go, oh God, there goes Caleb again. What a stupid. No, look it up. Look it up. She talks about it in her autobiography. She brags about having worked for the CIA. She and Zbigniew Brzezinski went to the World Youth Festival in Vienna and set off smoke bombs to try and hurt the Soviet Union. Her ties to the CIA are very, 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 very well documented. Gloria Steinem was kind of the voice of feminism in the 70s, was a CIA agent. She was synthetic left. She had been, kind of a, anti-communist socialist, and the CIA kind of picked her. There was this upsurge of interest in women's rights. And so they picked Gloria Steinem, and they said, all right, you're the one. And she got a lot of money and all of that, Hafia Sophia. All right, yeah. She got a lot of money, and yeah, I mean, that's what happened. Gloria Steinem's ties to the CIA are very well documented. Her boyfriend for many years was a Department of Justice, high-ranking official at the U.S. Department of Justice. Gloria Steinem has the deep state, FBI, CIA all over her. That doesn't mean feminism is bad. That just means that, just like everything else, right? That, it's kind of like the CIA started funding fake socialism in order to try and control the socialist movement in the United States with the Congress for Cultural Freedom. In the 70s, there was a huge upsurge of interest in women's liberation. And because of that, they appointed Gloria Steinem, a CIA person, to be the voice of it and kind of control it. Because, again, communists were associated with women's liberation. Communists, especially during that period, were known for posters of women with guns and Vietnamese freedom fighters and stuff. So they appointed a CIA woman, Gloria Steinem, to run the feminist movement. And she did. And she ran it in an anti-communist direction. Not surprisingly, so look it up. Just look it up. Google Gloria Steinem, CIA. It's a fact, okay? It's been in the New York Times. She admits it in her autobiography. It's a fact. That doesn't mean 70s radical feminism was bad. It was great that they built battered women's shelters. It's great that they fought for LGBT women's rights. It's great that they fought for the right of women to have reproductive choice. I'm not opposing any of that, okay? But I am saying that Gloria Steinem, and in a lot of ways, there was an attempt to control 1970s radical feminism by the intelligence agencies, just like the intelligence agencies try to control socialism and Marxism, just like the intelligence agencies try to control the media and everything, right? That's generally a lot of what the CIA does, is try to manipulate political discourse in the United States to be favorable to, capitalism and imperialism. So, yeah, that's the answer to that question. Alrighty. Trump, Bannon, breakup. Yes, Trump. It's not just Trump and Bannon. It's the United States for a long time. Right? The United States has been trying to separate Tibet from China. In the 1950s, there was the Tibet Civil War. Hundreds of thousands of people died. No one knows anything about it. The USA was airdropping weapons and guns into Tibet, and it was all kinds of violence and killing. Right? The USA, at this point, it seems like the USA, at least some elements in the USA are trying to play up the idea that the Muslim regions and the Uyghur regions should break away from China. Taiwan separatism is something that a lot of powerful forces in the United States support. Hong Kong separatism. The United States has been trying to break up China for a long time. Long time. And you're welcome for the response, camel spider attack. But that's just, that's been a long-standing plan of the United States. There's one China. That one China includes Taiwan, Hong Kong. It includes Tibet. It includes the Uyghur regions. There's one China, right? But for a long time, the United States has been trying to break apart China, just like they tried to break apart the Soviet Union. Just like they try to break apart, they broke apart Yugoslavia. They try to break apart any country, right? They try to play up ethnic rivalries and division. They try to, that's what they do. That's what the United States has done, especially in Eurasia. So there you go. Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture. I'm going to pour some more orange juice. Yeah, Stokely Carmichael and Kwame Ture. He later changed his name to Kwame Ture. One of the most, consistently, I guess, after the Black Panther Party broke apart, Stokely Carmichael, who'd been a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, had been in the Black Panthers. He eventually started his own party, the All African People's Revolutionary Party. Very much a scientific socialist, a Marxist, very charismatic. A lot of his speeches are on the internet. A very, very amazing, brilliant man. I could listen to Kwame Ture speak for hours. Great guy. I'm a big admirer of Kwame Ture. I've learned a lot from him. He was very supportive of Ba'athist Arab socialism as well as Marxism. He called him, he was, for what he called scientific socialism. Brilliant man. I could listen to him all day long. Brilliant man, brilliant writer. When I was at the gym back, remember the days before the COVID-19 where there were these things called gyms where you could go work out and blow off steam? Well, I used to go to those places called gyms, kids, that you've never heard of, right? Back in the day, when I was a young man, there used to be a thing called a gym, young man. And you could go there and get on a treadmill and work out at the gym. And sometimes you could lift these things called weights at the gym. And anyway, back in the day when I was a young man, there was this place called a gym. And I would put on my headphones at the gym. And at the gym, I would listen to Kwame Ture, and I would actually when I was back in the day when when I could go to the gym when life was normal before this pandemic nightmare. I would go to the gym and I would often listen to Kwame Ture while I was exercising. Great guy, great speaker, amazing speaker. And every speech he gives is very, very socialist. Socialism he was all about socialism. He was a black nationalist. He was a black revolutionary nationalist, but he was very much a socialist. He was given amazing speeches. I have great admiration for Kwame Ture. I've learned a lot from him. Again, I'm sure he said something that I don't approve of, okay? I'm sure there's a lot of people who like me who don't agree with everything I say, okay? So now, I can guarantee you there's somebody who's digging up something awful Kwame Ture said and going, aha, I got you. Well, I don't endorse whatever that awful thing you found is. I like his speeches on black liberation. I like his speeches on anti-imperialism. I like his speeches on socialism. If he said something at some point that's not good, well, I don't endorse it. Or maybe I do. Maybe I don't agree with you that it's bad. I don't know what it is, but... again, just because I learned something from somebody or have admiration for the work that they do, etc. I get a lot of flack. These people have attacked me for supporting Minister Farrakhan. Well, I don't endorse a lot of what Farrakhan says, right? I mean, his religious beliefs are very, very unique. The Nation of Islam, they have a very, very unique perspective. I definitely don't accept their doctrines. I don't religiously agree with them. He said some other things that I think you know what I'm talking about. I certainly don't endorse those other things he said. But Minister Farrakhan is one of the most important black leaders in all of U.S. history. He organized the Million Man March. He did amazing work. And on top of that, Minister Farrakhan is probably the most prominent anti-imperialist in this country. When Libya was being bombed, who spoke up? All the socialists and communists, except for a few exceptions, did nothing. The PSL, the Workers' World Party, they protested the bombing of Libya. But for the most part, all the socialists and communists were silent. Who organized tens of thousands of people in Harlem to march against the bombing of Libya? Minister Farrakhan. And Cynthia McKinney, too. Thanks, Dust James, for that. Minister Farrakhan is very pro-China. He hails the Belt and Road. Minister Farrakhan is very anti-imperialist. I think that Minister Farrakhan, despite his flaws, and again, you're immediately pulling up some stuff he said about Jewish folks, don't agree with that. Stuff he said about gay people, don't agree with that. But Minister Farrakhan, by being a leader of black people in the United States and organizing a strong, dedicated anti-imperialist black organization like the Nation of Islam, helping people get off drugs, organizing in the black community, while at the same time taking an anti-imperialist position and getting African Americans to align with anti-imperialists around the world and telling black people that it's in the interest of black Americans to be anti-imperialist. Minister Farrakhan is 1,000 times better than any any Trotskyite, well, with a few exceptions, 1,000 times better than a half the anarchists on the internet. You know, Minister Farrakhan is a very, very positive force in American history. You know, that's just a fact. I mean, you know, and again, I don't endorse the stuff he said that you have a problem with. And he doesn't want me to endorse it, right? And that's the thing. Their beliefs, I mean, it's not just the stuff that people find objectionable, okay? It's also, there's some, I mean, the Nation of Islam's theology is very unique to them. They don't even want white guys like me to agree with them. Trust me, I've spent a lot of time with them. They don't want white guys like me to agree with them. They don't even expect us to agree with them. So I don't, but that doesn't matter. If you are an objective Marxist, you have to admit that Minister Louis Farrakhan has been a positive force in American history. A positive force in the history of the country. I mean, overwhelmingly a positive force in the history of the country. If you don't want to agree with him, that's okay. But that's up to you. No one's expecting that, you know, I mean, but I'm just telling you, you know, an anti-imperialist. Mumia Abu-Jamal, the African-American political prisoner who's innocent, Mumia Abu-Jamal would be dead right now if it weren't for Minister Louis Farrakhan. In 1996, they were all ready to give the death penalty to Mumia Abu-Jamal. And it was a unique set of circumstances. Right? Many black revolutionaries in this country have been given the death penalty. Right? I mean, but the LA rebellion, the LA riots, followed by the Million Man March, and then followed by the fact that thousands and thousands of people, you know, from all over the world, from Europe, from South America, from France, from Germany, Amish people, all kinds of people, millions of people, you know, almost 1 million people came to Philadelphia to oppose the execution of Mumia Abu-Jamal. And Minister Farrakhan had convened a 1,000,000-man march that likely had 1 million people there. I mean, there's disputes, but probably 1 million, you know, people attended the 1,000,000-man march. And he had highlighted Mumia's case at the 1,000,000-man march. There were all kinds of people at the 1,000,000-man march talking about Mumia. That made the ruling class think, okay, if we execute Mumia Abu-Jamal, we could have a problem on our hands we don't want to have. You know, think about it. If it hadn't been for the 1,000,000-man march, Mumia Abu-Jamal might be dead. You know, if it hadn't been for the 1,000,000-man march, I mean, you know, I mean, look at the history of the United States and how important the 1,000,000-man march was. Our race and gender social constructs. I don't know what that means. I mean, I don't know what that means. So I mean, gender refers to the role that people play. There's a difference between gender and sex, right? So sex is biological. Gender is the role assigned to you by society, right? And I think gender, the way people understand it, right? In different societies, women and men act in different ways. I learned that, you know, I mean, the way that, you know, I don't want to be specific here, but there's ways that men act in the United States that, you know, that if you did it in other countries, people wouldn't like it. And there's ways that men act in other countries that is considered to be very, very acceptable. That if you did that here, people might think you're gay. So yeah, gender is not the same in every country. Gender expression is different. And race, I mean, okay, is race a social construct? I mean, Yeah, I guess. I mean, it's right. There's the whole documentary Race, The Power of an Illusion. So, yeah, I guess, yeah, okay, I'll give you that. I had to think about it for a moment. I mean, that's like a sweeping question, right? Are race and general social constructs? Well, I mean, I guess yes. I guess. I mean, that's a soft yes on my part because I don't want to, I mean, there might be a lot of black nationalists who would say my race is not a social construct. I am black. Blackness is a real thing. And who am I to say to them, oh, no, blackness is not a real thing. It's a social construct. Might be a lot of feminists who feel like, well, no, my gender is natural. There's something special about women. And who am I to say to them, oh, you can't? It's complicated. It's complicated. So that was probably a gotcha question to prove that I'm a transphobic secret neo-Nazi or something. Well, I mean, I gave you an honest answer to your gotcha question. If I were playing games with you, I would try to give you a slimy game answer to your question. I'm not doing that because I'm not playing games with you. I'm being real with you. You asked me, are they social constructs? And my answer was I had to think about it for a minute. And it's like, I guess they are, but you got to be careful about saying that, right? I would never want to say to a black nationalist, "Oh, you're not black. You're not black." I'm not going to say to a feminist, "You're not a woman." That's just I mean, you have to be careful, right? But yes, is the way gender expresses itself in society, is gender itself, gender behavior, is that a social construct? Of course it is, because it's so different in every society in history. Um, I've heard that there were Native American groups that had a number of different genders. You know, is race a social construct? Of course, right? I mean, the idea that certain races act certain ways, it evolves over time. Edward Said wrote a very good book called Orientalism, talking about how the stereotypes about Middle Easterners have evolved and adapted, over time. So the idea that there's just some natural way that people from the Middle East are. So yeah, took me a minute to think about it though, but whatever. Whatever. I'm gonna be real with you. That's my plan. I'm real with you. I am real with you. I'm real with you. If you ask me a question, I'm gonna give you a real answer. And if I've answered that, the only reason, certain questions come up and I'm not answering them because I've answered them a million times. And if I just keep answering them, it just makes them a constant theme, and I don't want to do that. But for the most part, you ask me a question, I'll be real with you. All right, we just talked about Stokely Carmichael. Finnish Bolshevik. Yeah, it's a great YouTube channel. I've learned a lot from it. I was going to go on there at some point. They were going to have me on. Maybe they'll have me on at some point. All right, cancel culture debate. Okay. Yeah, I Finnish Bolsheviks, great channel. I like a lot of the content. I'd go on there. All right. I was asked about traditionalists. Well, traditionalism is a school of conservatism. It's okay. First of all right, let's clear one thing up. Okay, traditionalists are not fascists. Traditionalists are their own thing. Fascism is an ideology. It's a form of capitalist rule and such. But traditionalism is a form of conservatism that I don't agree with. It's Julius Evola. I'm trying to think. I don't know the other traditionalists, but it's a school of thought that argues that the truth is found in studying different traditions and societal structures and mythologies and finding like the common grain of truth in all of them. It's a very right-wing idea. It's kind of the definition of conservatism, and I don't agree with it. Julius Evola is probably the traditionalist thinker I'm the most familiar with, and I don't agree with his teachings, but that's basically what traditionalism is. We're going to study all these ancient traditional ways and try to find some little truth in them. And, I don't buy that. I mean, who knows? I mean, psychology is looking at, at how human minds work. And of course, human minds work different. And traditions are different in different societies. They evolve based on the needs of society, the mode of production, etc. But I think that fundamentally trying to find the truth about humanity in traditions itself and comparing them, that is not fundamentally correct. Now, Julius Evola, it's complicated. Julius Evola rejected the ideology of fascism, but the fascist Italian state promoted him. The only reason he became well known was because the fascist Italian state was like promoting his ideas. So he had ties to fascism. His beliefs were different. Fascism is a very modernist ideology. Julius Evola is a traditionalist. So someone said, no, read some thinkers. I've never heard of those guys, so I can't comment on that. Okay. Yeah, so, right, there's this church in Turkey that's being converted into a mosque. Obviously, many Christians are deeply offended by that. Many Muslims think it's a good idea, that it's a defeat over Western colonialism. And, I hate to see Christians and Muslims fighting each other. Not a good thing when they're clashing like that. It's a provocative, symbolic move. It's going to offend a lot of people. Um, Gaddafi converted a Catholic cathedral in Italy into a mosque, and that was a political statement about Italian colonialism. But Turkey isn't a Muslim, a majority Muslim country, but there's Christians there. I think it's a bad idea. Honestly, I don't think it's a good move. Some might argue it was an expression of Turkey's self-determination. Something that's going to incite, especially at this time when the imperialists are fomenting sectarian religious divisions. I don't really think it's a good idea. I don't think they should do that. Yeah, but again, there might be Muslim people who see it as a victory over Christian colonizers and stuff. So, I hate to see a fight like this break out. So that's all I can say. All right. Cancel culture debate. Yeah, folks. Oh, Mussolini. Oh, we'll talk about that. Okay. All right. So, folks, the cancel culture debate. All right. So, there was this article in Harper's Magazine. I don't know if folks saw it. That was basically calling out cancel culture. And it was signed by Noam Chomsky and J.K. Rowling and all kinds of people. And it was very vague. It was very, very vague. It didn't talk about any specific cases. It kind of alluded to some things. It referenced the rise of illiberalism around the world, which, as you know, that's a big theme in U.S. foreign policy discourse. Illiberalism, i.e., countries that are breaking out of the Western system. Right? That's there's all these articles about illiberalism where basically countries stop being democratic when they disagree with the United States. It's democratic regression. And, it's this whole, article. But, honestly, though, I will say, okay, that, first of all, it was a very vague thing, right? And obviously, cancel culture isn't the biggest problem. The biggest problem is American capitalism and imperialism and, and all that. But, the cancel culture stuff is a little bit unnerving. People make mistakes. People say things. I've said things that I don't agree with anymore. And there is this, the Twitter mobs, where they just, they take something out of context or something somebody said, and they just, controversial opinions. Should be allowed, right? And that it's just, cancel culture. It's pretty extreme. I'm not a fan. I'm a fan of open discourse, I guess. So yeah, cancel culture. There's some stuff going on that's not good. Okay, and that it's one thing to say someone's wrong, but someone being wrong doesn't make them Hitler. And that's one thing that the Twitter mobs don't seem to understand. It's like, you said something I disagree with, so therefore, you are evil and must be destroyed. I don't agree with that. If I did that to everyone I disagreed with, I'm sorry, right? Now, to be fair, people should be called out. In mainstream media should be, and a lot of the people who signed that ad should be called out, honestly. So it's complicated. It's a very, very complicated thing. But at the same time, yeah, some of this stuff is, look at some of the people who've gone after me, for Christ's sakes. Some of the stuff these people say is so off the wall and ridiculous. They think I'm a social Darwinist. Yeah, really. Yeah, that's me. Survival of the fittest. Yeah, just let all the poor people starve and die because they're biological. They just make shit up. There's so many people, and that's the sad thing, is that there's so many people who think that they're accomplishing something by going after somebody for some stupid stuff. And you're not accomplishing anything. And I know people, and it's like, hey, did you hear what so-and-so said? This person just made this tweet that I don't, it's like, calm down. You know, I know people on different sides of a lot of arguments. You know, my positions for an American, most Americans don't agree with me, right? Most Americans are far more hostile to socialist countries, etc. And, you know, I mean, do I say to all those Americans, fuck you, go die? Of course not. I disagree with them. But if I just said to everyone who disagreed with me, fuck you, go die, I wouldn't get very far. And, you know, this notion that you're going to expose somebody, I mean, it's juvenile. You're not really accomplishing anything. It's this culture of destruction. And I mean, it's a problem. I believe in a constructive socialism, socialism about building, not a socialism about tearing things down. So that's my answer to that question. There are probably some specific cases that get highlighted around cancel culture where I maybe it was the right thing to do. So it's complicated. All right. Mussolini. Yeah, Mussolini stopped being a socialist because he supported World War I. That was the main reason. But yeah, I mean, if you read Mussolini's autobiography, he says that the Socialist Party were a bunch of wimps because they didn't believe in violent revolution. Which is weird. And that's kind of what I was getting at in my debate with this fascist individual, is it's like with Mussolini, it's all about violence. Is there violence in communism? Of course. But with Mussolini, the violence in and of itself is good. It's like he's against the Socialist Party because they're not violent. Well, he stopped being a socialist, so wouldn't he be happy they weren't violent? Yeah, but they're a bunch of wimps because they're not violent. But yeah, I mean, he formed his group and he supported World War I. That was the main reason he broke with socialism, was because he was a supporter of World War I. The socialist movement opposed it. Mussolini was kind of a Sorelian syndicalist, and then he supported World War I. And his black shirts were big supporters of World War I. And they went around beating up and killing communists. And, Italian fascism, led to some really brutal torture and killing of lots of communists. I mean, read about what they did with castor oil and like making people shit themselves until they died. Not pleasant stuff. And then Mussolini, there was an element of just, worship of violence and cruelty. There's actually an artistic movement that was associated with Mussolini. It's called the Futurist movement. And there's a document they wrote called the Futurist Manifesto. And if you read it, the Futurist Manifesto, that's that ugly side of the revolutionary intelligentsia. That's, killing and destruction is the best way to move forward. Futurism, right? And that Italian fascism had this violent fetish about it. It was not, we're going to use violence to achieve an end. It's like violence itself is beautiful, and that's insane thinking. Violence itself is not beautiful. And that fetishization of violence, that belief that violence in and of itself is just this amazing liberatory act, that's deranged. And there's some of that on the ultra left also, that violence is good in and of itself. That's deranged thinking. And that, the Italian fascists, that was a big part of what they were about. And that's the revolutionary intelligentsia. That's that middle class, adventurist element. And I think that some of the worst elements of the socialist movement did move into the fascist camp. And that happened in Nazi Germany as well, right? There was, the Nazis, they played up this kind of romanticized violence and myth, and that fascism, there's a little grain of truth. Okay, fascism's a right-wing movement. It's anti-communist and all of that. But there's a little grain of truth in some of the liberal fascism narrative, which is that fascism is a right-wing ideology that exists within that middle-class revolutionary intelligentsia. And that's true. That cafe culture, those, middle-class intellectual, bohemian type kind of people, right? The people that, people say hippies, but that's different. Hippies is like a 1960s thing. But that European salon cafe culture where they're talking about Marx and Freud and drinking lots of coffee and European intellectuals. Fascism was in that milieu, as was Marxism, as was Freudianism, as was social democracy, as was traditionalism, as was the occult, as was all kinds of stuff, right? A lot of ideas originated in that milieu, that kind of European middle class, bohemian intellectual milieu, the cafes of Paris and Vienna, that milieu. Someone who said the people who read Jacobin. Well, there you go. But but that milieu, right, where yes, you'll find communists in that milieu, but they're not that entire milieu, right? Aleister Crowley, the occultist, that was his milieu. Sigmund Freud, the psychoanalyst, that was his milieu. And fascism was part of that middle class current. And that as the German Communist Party went into the working class, the Nazis kind of more solidified among that group. Many people comment on how early on in the Nazi Party, there were a lot of gay Nazis. Now, later, the Nazis put gays in concentration camps. But early on, in the early years of Nazism, when they were this street-fighting group of, right-wing thugs who thought they were going to restore Valhalla or something, that there were a lot of gay Nazis. And in fact, the leader of the SA, the stormtroopers, was Ernst Rem, and he was gay. And that many people commented on probably the reason that early on there were a lot of gay Nazis was because of the Nazis, that was, watch the movie Cabaret, for example. It was the Berlin, the cafe culture, that intellectual milieu was much more tolerant of homosexuality at that time. Berlin was kind of the gay capital of Europe, and the Nazis were kind of a current within that middle class intellectual strata. And so that's why there was kind of an over-representation of gay people in the early years of the Nazi Party. But then, as the Nazis took power, they changed their position and they killed Ernst Rem and all that. But yeah, that's part of why that was. And yeah, that the only grain of truth I would say in that whole fascism is left-wing narrative. Fascism is not left-wing. The only grain of truth is that fascism did originate in that middle-class intellectual milieu that Marxism was represented largely in, that Freudianism and the occult and all kinds of stuff was, but fascism started in that current as well, right? Hitler was an art school failure. He couldn't get into art school. He wanted to be a painter and was hanging out in coffee shops in Vienna and, writing operas about, the Christian invaders being defeated by pagan Odinists and, that there's an element of, and the thing is though, and this is what people don't understand, in the United States at this time, that whole milieu is considered to be left-wing, right? In the United States now, if you're a pagan, you're not a Christian, you must be left-wing. The United States right now, if you've studied psychoanalysis, well, you're not a traditional, you don't have a conservative worldview, so you must be a left-wing. If you know anything about the occult or, but all these trends are not left-wing in and of themselves. But in the United States, we don't quite get that, right? Because, New York City is really, there's very little, that milieu, that bohemian middle-class culture, there's very little of that in the United States. New York City, you obviously have it. That's like Williamsburg, hipsters and all of that. But for the most part, a lot of the United States, you don't have that. So people think that that's inherently left-wing. Okay? And it's not. There's a lot of trends among that milieu that are very right-wing, like Tibetan Buddhism, for example. Tibetan Buddhism was something that Julius Evola and fascists and all of them loved, right? Falun Gong is very big in that milieu, and they like Trump. And Scientology, right? There's a lot of trends within that intelligentsia, middle class, I don't know what you want to call it. There's a lot of trends in that milieu that are quite right-wing, but a lot of Americans think that entire milieu is left-wing. It ain't, okay? It's not, right? A lot of the Eastern gurus are very, very right-wing, and are tied, for example, to Hindu nationalism in India. The Hare Krishna movement is a very right-wing political movement. However, in the USA, because they're playing drums and they're in cities and they're not Christian, they're mystical, people assume they're left-wing. They ain't left-wing, right? And it's I think that because there's so much confusion ideologically, people assume that everyone who's in that milieu is left-wing. They're not. And so I think that's the basis for people saying, well, Hitler, he was a painter, he was a vegetarian, he was into non-Christian religion, he must be left-wing. Wrong, right? Mussolini, right? Originally he was left-wing, quit being left-wing, and developed Italian fascism, the futurist current that it believes violence is the greatest, and violence and masculinity is the answer to everything. Not left-wing. The futurists were not left-wing, but if you think that everyone in that milieu is left-wing, then you would think that they're left-wing. That's the confusion. Okay, I think that answered everyone's super chats. It's been fun, folks. Anything else that folks want me to talk about? Anything else? Anything else before I get into... I did want to talk about one little brief thing. I just wanted to end with some very, very quick remarks. So tell you what, I'll give you my quick closing remarks, and if there's super chats, I'll answer them, and then we're done. Just wanted to comment, what keeps you going? What keeps you going? There are moments where it seems like the whole world is going to hell. There are moments where everything seems to be going wrong. There are moments where the world seems quite hopeless. So what keeps you going in such times? And human beings naturally need the ability to keep going in such times, right? If you don't keep going, if you become completely hopeless and depressed, you become suicidal, right? I mean, that's when people lose the ability to keep going, they become suicidal, they become depressed, they become destructive. But the ability to keep going in the darkest times, right? Ideology, belief, fanaticism, purposes higher than yourself, that's what keeps people going. Right? That's what rescues people in moments of hopelessness, is their ability to keep believing in something. And if you look throughout human history, there are many great examples of people in moments of great adversity who find a spiritual power that gives them the ability to not only keep going and surviving, but to actually do miraculous and amazing things. Now, you can argue maybe this is a material force. Maybe this is the human psyche. This is something we do as human beings. We develop religions and ideologies as a way to preserve ourselves, to keep ourselves going in the face of great adversity. Maybe it is human beings tapping into a spiritual force. It's up for you to decide. But it is a fact that when human beings are faced with great adversity, yes, there are some forces that are overcome and destroyed, but there are also forces that are able to overcome that great adversity. And they do it by developing beliefs, by developing passion and truth and principles, and devoting themselves to that. And it's a way they save themselves from harsh circumstances. And I'm going to go over just a few examples, most of them from U.S. history, not all of them, of people doing that. Nat Turner. Are people familiar with Nat Turner? I got in big trouble when I was a freshman in high school because I said that Nat Turner was my hero. I wouldn't say that now necessarily. I still think he's a great, admirable person. I wouldn't list him as my greatest hero. But I listed Nat Turner. I was asked to say who was my hero, and I said Nat Turner. And that got me in a lot of trouble because they thought, I was told, my history teacher said he was a murderer, he was a killer, and that, there was a parent-teacher conference about that. It's kind of sad. But Nat Turner, who was Nat Turner? Well, Nat Turner was a slave. And he was a slave, and he ran away and fled from slavery. And then when he was in the mountains, in the woods, he had a spiritual experience. He believed that God spoke to him and told him to return to the plantation and to organize a slave revolt. And so Nat Turner turned around, went back to the slave plantation, became a pastor, right? Because that was the only meeting that slaves were allowed to have. It was church. Became the pastor and used the church as a cover for organizing his huge, massive slave revolt. Can you imagine the level of bravery? What inspires a person to do like Nat Turner did, right? He was already free. He'd already escaped. He just had to run up to Canada. But in a moment, he has this spiritual experience, and it tells him to return to slavery. so you can organize a huge explosive insurrection. And Nat Turner's revolt shook the U.S. South. Never in U.S. history had there been that big of a slave revolt. Fascinating. And also read about the ghost dance. Folks familiar with the ghost dance? In 1888, 1889, right, the Sioux people, indigenous people, they were nomadic people. And they had been, forced onto a reservation, forced to give up their nomadic life. Forced onto a reservation. They were dying of disease. They were broken, destroyed, right? And somebody named Wovoka, a Native American, had a vision. And he said, this is what Wovoka said. He said, "My brothers, I bring you word from your fathers, the ghosts, that they are marching now to join you, led by the Messiah who came once to earth to live with the white man, but was killed by them. I bring you the promise of the day in which there will be no white man to lay his hand on the bridle of the Indian horse, when the red man of the prairie will rule the world." And Wovoka builds this mass religious movement among the Native Americans, based on this vision he's had that the white man is going to be defeated by Jesus, the Messiah, who's going to come down from heaven. Right? The white people are so afraid of Wovoka, that first, you had the death of Chief Sitting Bull, right? The Native American police went and arrested Chief Sitting Bull, and there was a fight, and he was killed. And then later you had the brutal massacre at Wounded Knee, because the white people were so terrified of the ghost dance movement. Right? You can talk about Bobby Sands. Bobby Sands, right? He's an Irish liberation fighter. He's arrested, sentenced to prison, and he and the other prisoners are told that they cannot be prisoners of war. They're going to be treated as common criminals, even though they're Irish people fighting for their freedom. So they refuse to put on prison uniforms, so they're forced to be naked. They're naked in their cells. They won't let them use the bathroom, so pretty soon their cells are full of shit. Their conditions are so bad in the H block that they go on hunger strike. And Bobby Sands and others, they starve themselves to death to raise awareness about the Irish freedom struggle and how they're being treated. And it shakes the world. I don't know if folks know about John Africa. John Africa was in Philadelphia, right? And after, the defeat of the Black Liberation Movement in many ways, the Black Liberation Movement of the 70s had been crushed, the Black Panthers, John Africa starts the MOVE organization. He doesn't believe in cruelty to animals. He protests against the zoo. And he and a small group of people in Philadelphia, they have an organization, MOVE, on a move, long live John Africa, right? And they have their organization in Philadelphia. And the response of the Philadelphia Police Department is to bomb their home, burn them, kill them. It's fascinating stuff. That when people are facing great opposition, great hardship, they find something within themselves. They get connections to something higher, and it gives them the power to heroically resist and fight for a better world. Something really deep to think about. Because right now we are facing very hard times. 18 million unemployed in the United States. Pretty soon there's going to be a lot of home foreclosures. Pretty soon there's going to be a lot of people living on the streets. There's going to be a lot of problems pretty soon. We're already seeing the malnutrition. The amount of homeless people I see in my neighborhood is higher than it's ever been. I've lived here for 5 or 6 years. Right? There's a political crisis in the country. The ruling class are fighting with one another. The capitalist system is grinding to a halt. But what are people going to do in this time? How are people going to find that inner power to be heroic, to resist, to fight back, to do amazing things? How are they going to, where is this going to come from? What's it going to look like? How are people going to stand up in this time? Who will be the Nat Turners of our time? Who will be the Bobby Sands of our time? Who will be the John Africas of our time? What's going to happen next? Because, yes, some people will be crushed. Some people will be destroyed. But humanity, like any other species, it has the will to live. It doesn't go quietly. What's the explosion going to look like? What is the coming insurrection going to look like? Just something to think about. Just something to think about there. But on that note, folks, if there's not any more super chats or questions, I'm going to call it a night. If you want to support this program, right, if you want to support my work and you don't have a question, feel free to just become a Patreon supporter below, right? We can always just do that. There'll be a Patreon member only live. And, I'll be interacting specifically with my patrons. But, we're going to keep doing these public lives just like we always have been. So I appreciate everything you do. You all are deeply, deeply important to me. Deeply important to me. We're like a family here. We're a community. We're building something exciting. The Center for Political Innovation is moving ahead. Some exciting developments are going on. Don't want to say too much about it. But yeah, good things are happening. There's plenty of reason to be optimistic despite these dark times. But we have a special project here. We want to save the United States from this disaster. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Say it louder. We need a government of action to fight for working families. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. While the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today. We need a government of action to fight for working families. Have a good night, folks. All my best.